Welcome to the White House. Good morning. My name is Jay Hine. I direct the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. It's my delight to welcome you today. It's a nice rainy day to wait in a long line outside the Eisenhower building. I apologize for that. Security is what it is, and you don't want to see what happens if you skip that line, actually. So sorry that we're here for an important task. Let me place us in the context of these events. First, you are at a Compassion in Action Roundtable event, which is a monthly gathering that we host here in the President's Briefing Room, which aspires to do a few things at once. Our first objective is to break your hearts. What we want to do is talk about the social crises of our day, which are simply unacceptable. We have talked in this room about prisoners returning to society, 700,000 of them that return to our communities unprepared to fit back into community life, so they have a 2/3 rearrest rate. And that is not a humanitarian thing, it is not a safety thing, and it is not an economic thing that is anywhere in our best interests. And we've talked about malaria in Africa, which claims 1 million deaths a year in sub-Saharan Africa. Disease that is preventable and treatable. And today we're talking about one of the more horrific and poorly understood issues in modern society. And you'll hear from expert speakers in government and in civil society that'll define that problem for you, the plague of human trafficking, the shadowy industry that it is. And so our first objective is to say, you know what, that's a problem, and it's unacceptable that problem exists. And not to stop there, but to move to a second point then, which is to give you hope. Because some people are solving this problem. Lives are being transformed. Criminals are being prosecuted. And hope is indeed being restored because we have a government in action in the United States government, local government. We have a good sheriff from San Antonio I just met. We have law enforcement officials. We have international leadership that are awakening to this problem and doing something about it. But mostly we have civil society in action, caring for victims, identifying where these problems exist, and leading us in the pathway. And the third objective for these events, which you'll see on display today, is that we want to do these two things to create more burden by all of us. And of course, this is the preaching to the choir part of the deal, because you all get it. You're leaders. That's why you're in these chairs. You represent the academy, your scholars. You represent the practitioners who figured out how to do this work, from enforcement to care, your philanthropists that pay for this work, your government officials that coordinate policy and funding and strategy. You are those that have led us. So we are going to not only hopefully feed you and equip you to do what you do better, but also to be in each other's company and to relate to one another, learn from each other. There's adequate time in the formal program and some discussion time, but also following when we have a reception that you get to meet each other and interact, because you'll only hear from a handful of leaders today, but you each have something to say, and we want you to have that benefit as well. But again, for purposes of this event, we want to create more burden and to create hope, while third, we place those two things in the context of a better and smarter national strategy, indeed international strategy. So what do we do post this event? Because we know the contours of this problem, and we're going to hear it again when we see that 27 million victims we are estimating is in this business, with close to 1 million more adding to its number, not enough detracting from its number yet. So we know that that's a problem of significant proportions. We know the criminal activity that fuels it, the tens of billions of dollars that make this, I think I've read, the third largest industry of illicit activity on the planet, behind guns and narcotics, fast approaching the number one spot, shows that we have a criminal element that is not benign here, that they're actively trying to make it worse. And so the proportions are quite large. It's good that we're all in action, and you'll see that revealed today. It's not good enough that we're not coordinated enough and there's not enough of us. And so this third piece, this national strategy, international strategy piece, is that today's a purposeful event to not only have a good, strong conversation, but to help us all lead more effectively, leveraged, and coordinated. And what that looks like, we don't know on the front end. We'll learn from you today. We will meet more of you today. And then our leaders responsible for this portfolio will hopefully integrate us into a bigger and better whole. And one of the subplots and the central tenets actually of my office, the Faith-Based Community Initiative, is that it isn't a separate program. This isn't us on the side, an extra thing in government. What we're trying to do is add value to governing. So underneath government strategy, what you're seeing is how can new and better partnerships form, whether or not a government grant's ever involved or a government strategy is leading the deal, but how does the public space look like government actors plus civil society actors, not just in the same space, but leveraging each other's strengths. That's a big aspiration for us and mission statement. When the president formed our initiative, he said it's determined to tack on need. We're a pragmatic, problem-solving endeavor. So it is my honor to welcome you because you are our mission. You're working this out in a very important public policy domain. So with that, I say welcome. And put your seatbelts on because you are going to be treated to an explosion of ideas and inspiration and provocative, I think, questions and challenges. And we have the ideal person to start that off. Gary Haugen is president of the International Justice Mission. You can see his formal bio as well as the formal bios of all your presenters in the wonderful program that is in your materials. You probably have about 5 pounds of paper on your lap. We spared you the full arsenal of information that depicts how strong our presenters are, the body of work that they bring with them. Gary was one of us in that he served at the Department of Justice, so he was a Fed. He worked inside government, and he designed policy, and he worked at a very high level inside government. He's Ivy League trained and brings all the right academic credentials to a national and international voice and credibility and prestige that he brings to the platform that he occupies. And that for a decade at International Justice Mission, he'll describe his work. He's been a tireless advocate to do much of what I described earlier in terms of the purposes of this event. He has broken a lot of hearts and opened a lot of eyes and galvanized a lot of action. And so we admire him for that. When I thought about the scope of the work, the contours of the problem, the shadowy industry, and the really the kind of pervasive nature of this work and how hard it is, and then I thought about the panels, the speakers that you hear today, and particularly Gary. I thought, I have confidence with this team. I feel good about our prospects when I see leaders that you'll see today. I like our odds. And Gary typifies that. You see Gary stand up here, strong-looking guy. That's going to give you some confidence. But what I think you'll hear in his words is the strength of his character, the spiritual formation and the heart that he has. I know that's resonant and reflective in a lot of you that occupy these chairs. But it's why I'm delighted with Gary to welcome you to the podium and let you to start us off after I think we see your story first captured in video. So can we cue that up, and then you'll hear from Gary Haugen. We're going to fix the volume. It's a little hard to hear back there. We haven't dubbed it, so if I could beg your patience, we'll Gary, do you have a song? IJM sort of fight song? Want to see how the White House works? I don't know how it works. Do you want me to get the control? They know. Okay. Well, what makes me feel better is I watched a program on the internet yesterday. There it is. I watched an author's talk at Google headquarters on this issue, actually. An author, is he here, actually? There he is. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about your book? The title of it, I just listened to you on the internet yesterday, and when you struggled with your PowerPoint at Google, I thought,
being at Google, and to work your PowerPoint. Particularly when you helped found Business 2.0 magazine, which is about business technology.
I can't tell you the comfort it's bringing me this very morning.
Exactly. So, David Batts done. Really hard a book to find that's not for sale.
There it is. There it is. Not for sale.
Well, my organization is terribly nervous that I will be underappreciated as a speaker if there isn't some dramatic media buildup to my coming here. So I'll try to persevere nevertheless. Jay, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the warm introduction. Hope ought to come just from all of us being here together in this room. 10 years ago when I started to hear just for the first time, because we all hear for the first time about these problems of modern day slavery, there just weren't any full rooms that I'd ever been in on the topic. So it is just very exciting to get to be here. And thank you for convening this, and thank you all for coming. I'm sorry that the media clips that my mother put together are not available. But we'll have to do that another time. I do have the privilege of serving as president of International Justice Mission, and those of you who are perhaps not familiar with International Justice Mission, we're a collection of lawyers, criminal investigators, social workers, and we get case referrals from organizations, especially faith-based organizations that are serving amongst the poor overseas, and they send us cases of violence, of sexual exploitation, of slavery and other forms of oppression. And we mobilize professional investigations of these cases, intervene on behalf of the victims, and try to bring victim relief, perpetrator accountability. We try to provide aftercare for those victims, and then bring about structural prevention. We started out with just a small office here in Washington, D.C., but now have 16 offices around the world. The vast majority of our almost 300 full-time staff now are nationals working in their own countries. But over the last 10 years, we've worked literally thousands of individual trafficking cases. And Jay mentioned that one of the most important sort of functions today is to simply have our heart broken. I think if we're not motivated by our hearts, the battle is just too tough. It takes too long. And if we don't connect to the heart of the experience of the victims, I think we just run out of gas. And so I would like us this morning just to be reminded of the experience of the victims. And I have to say, though, that for me, even though I've been involved with this problem for almost a decade now, it's hard for me to actually connect at a human level, honestly, with the victims of trafficking and their families, because their lives are just so completely different than mine. Because after you have sung the first few choruses of We Are the World, it's really pretty hard to actually hold up a conversation with somebody who's lived the nightmare of abduction, of beatings, of serial rape, and of slavery. Someone who literally is not treated as well as the dog that lives in my house. I mean, how do you actually relate to a person like that? What common point of human experience could someone like me or you, how could we actually connect? But interesting, over time, I found one point of connection that's almost universal, and that's the experience of being in the developing world amongst the poor and connecting with parents. In fact, let me introduce you to a Cambodian parent. It's a woman named Mary. She lives in a universe that's completely different from my own because she lives in a squatter camp outside Phnom Penh. But I can connect to her even though she's from a different universe because she's a parent, and like me, she has a daughter. But her daughter has been missing for weeks. Mary and her family struggle to put food on the table, and they have a 16-year-old daughter named Bopa. And so because of the struggle with poverty, one day some men came to the family and said, hey, we can get Bopa a job in one of the port cities peeling shrimp. And why don't you send your daughter with us? But Mary, of course, refused the offer because, like most of us, she didn't want her teenage daughter so far away from her. She worried what would happen to her. But one day, Bopa was just gone, simply gone. And Mary heard absolutely nothing for weeks. For weeks, she says she couldn't eat or sleep. Friends and neighbors told her that Bopa was probably dead. I died too, Mary said. Later, Mary then received shocking news. A neighbor reported that a friend had actually seen Bopa, but she was hundreds of miles away across the border in Thailand, locked in a brothel. It turns out that the people who were offering to take Bopa for a job peeling shrimp were actually working for sex traffickers. And these patient predators ultimately prevailed on Bopa's own sense of financial responsibility for her family and wooed her away without Bopa telling her mother. And soon, like hundreds of thousands of other teenagers in Asia, Bopa found herself transported hundreds of miles from her home and sold into a brutal brothel where she was just beaten into submission and forced to submit to repeated rapes from paying customers. Of course, as soon as Mary heard about her daughter, she did what you and I would do. She called the police to get their help. But the local police just made excuses and they demanded money that Bopa just didn't have. That Mary didn't have. We had no money, Mary said. We could not do anything. We could not do anything. See, I don't care who you are or what you own or what you don't own. If you've ever had a child in trouble, you and Mary are actually now in the same universe. It's not just the child who's in trouble when you're a parent who's got a kid in trouble, but now you're in trouble, right? Because like every parent, your heart is walking around in somebody else's body. And now your kid is in trouble. And while you would do anything, by some nightmarish conspiracy of events, you find that you can't do anything. That's the wrenching vulnerability of loving someone very much in an unsafe world. And whether we are parents or not, if we've ever loved someone deeply in an unsafe world, it turns out that Mary is not a total stranger. Mary's not a stranger, she's a parent. And like all of us, she right now needs some help. And fortunately, it is actually possible to help parents like Mary. In fact, in partnership with the U.S. government, IJM has had the privilege of training a special Cambodian police unit to fight sex trafficking and other crimes against children in Cambodia. And in this case, the IJM team was able to follow up our investigative leads and take up that police contingent across the border to rescue Bopa and to eventually rescue 9 other women and children abducted by the same trafficking ring. IJM was then able to work with the authorities to prevent the victimization of additional girls by securing the arrest and conviction of the brothel keeper and then 5 traffickers who will spend the next decade in prison rather than spending the next decade trafficking and raping children. But what matters most to Mary, of course, is what? Is that she has her daughter back. In fact, Bopa is being cared for in one of our partner aftercare centers, and she's doing well. Bopa receives treatment for her trauma and vocational training so that she can build a future. And this is what her mom told us earlier this year. She said, when Bopa was taken, it was very hard for me. No one believed I would ever get my daughter back. IJM was my backbone because I could not stand up to this without you. When I learned that IJM and the police had rescued her in Thailand, I felt like I was born again. For days I did not feel like I was walking on land, but floating in the heavens. She's in a good place and receiving good training. I now have hope for my daughter's future. I now have hope for my daughter's future. I think that's just about all we fundamentally ask for our children. And let there be no mistake, IJM was able to bring this assistant and has this wonderful story to tell only because of the support of the U.S. government in this process, to provide funding for operations, to train those police, but also to transform the political will of the Cambodian authorities to actually do it. Moreover, the aftercare that is utterly indispensable in these cases has only been possible because of IJM's partnerships with other NGOs. This is a good story for Bofa and Mary only because of partnership. Nagaraj is another parent, and another parent who just needs some help. He has 3 boys, and he loves them. But he can't take them to school, and he can't take them to doctors when they're sick, not because there aren't schools and not because there aren't doctors in his community, but because he doesn't even own his children. Nagaraj and his children are slaves. They're forced to live within the concrete cells inside the 4 walls of a brick factory. And along with about 80 other slaves, Nagaraj and his wife and children work literally 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, working and making bricks. If anyone tries to run away from the brick factory, they're chased down, dragged back in front of the others, and viciously beaten. Nagaraj and his children will spend their entire life as slaves inside the brick factory. The children will typically start with a few bricks upon their head until they work up to carrying loads of 25 to 60 pounds, making 100 trips a day back and forth across the brickyard. All just to wake up and do it all over again. This is not the day that my children woke up to this morning, but it is the day that Nagaraj's children wake up to each day. Of course, as parents, our most basic instinct is to provide for and protect our children. But for millions of slaves in our world, imagine the base humiliation of knowing you cannot protect your children from endless toil and abuse. You don't even own your children. Someone else does. And I can tell you from having spent time with Nagaraj, he doesn't get used to it. He doesn't see his children as barnyard animals that were created for a life of toil underneath a harness like animals. Every day he gets up thinking, how can I get them out of here? How can I get them to school? How can I get them free from here? He doesn't get used to it. And joyously, when his cries to God go up, which is what we parents do in those moments of utter desperation, we just cry out to God. And joyously, God answers those prayers. For Nagaraj and his wife and boys, God answered those prayers by moving IJM's anti-slavery advocates into action. Brave undercover agents were able to actually infiltrate the brick factory and successfully videotape the slaves at work, as well as the overseer's own explanations of how it is that they go about chasing down the slaves that run away and dragging them back and punishing them. Nagaraj himself then bravely managed to smuggle scores of his fellow slaves out of the factory for brief rendezvous with our investigators, and then prepared sworn statements of his bondage and that of the other slaves. And armed with this overwhelming evidence, IJM's local Indian advocates were able to mobilize a police raid on the factory and liberate all 80 of those slaves. The slave master's factory is now shut down, and he is facing prosecution. Most importantly for Nagaraj, of course, is that his children are free to play, and free to go to school. And for Nagaraj, this is no small thing. His children are no one's possession. Their daddy is not a slave, but a man. He's a protector, he's a provider, and he's a father. And this is all he really asked for from God, was just a chance to be a good father, to be a good husband, to be a good man. And how happy God must be to see what we see, to see the way Nagaraj loves and delights over his children, to see the way he honors his wife, to see the way they've worked together now to build a brick business of their own, to see the way he leads the association of former slaves as they rebuild their lives together, to see the way he has volunteered to work with IJM at considerable risk to actually liberate other slaves. But he needed a little help. And I can relate to that because I've been a parent. And as a parent, your heart is walking around in somebody else's body, and sometimes you just need some help. And that's how I connect to parents all over the world who simply ask us. They ask us for a chance to find their kids, a chance to feed their kids, a chance to protect their kids. They don't ask us to take care of their kids. They just ask us to give them a fighting chance, because at the moment they need a little help. And I think that's what all of us in this room would very much like to do, is to give them a little help. And I think the way to help, very simply, is in partnership. Partnership with the public sector, the private sector, and NGOs. Our experience over the past 10 years affirms what is represented really by this gathering, that the problem of modern-day slavery is an all-hands-on-deck proposition, that the victims of trafficking deserve excellent partnership on their behalf. And where does excellent partnership come from? In my experience, both in government and out of government, it comes from focusing on the victims and what matters to them. It's interesting the way when one focuses on the victims and what matters to them, all the other more trivial concerns and contests just kind of fade away. The more trivial dramas of the partnership fade away, and what matters to the victims is brought to the forefront. Focus on them, I think, is what our theme should be. All good things of this partnership, I think, will come from focusing on the victims and what matters to them. Focusing on them, and less worthy things will fall away. Who gets credit will fall away. Ideology will fall away. Who's scoring points will fall away. And especially for faith-based NGOs, my aspiration for IJM is that our faith would actually make us different as a partner with others. That our faith would allow us to be generous with others. That our faith would allow us to tell the truth. That our faith would allow us to be transparent. That our faith would allow us to persevere, even when it becomes hard and even when it's not fashionable. I think this is the kind of partnership that the victims deserve, and I think this is the kind of partnership we all yearn to be. Thank you very much for letting me be part of the opening this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary. You did not need a dramatic presentation to precede your remarks. That was a dramatic presentation. It was a perfect introduction to why we're here and why we can have hope. Thank you very much. And that theme will continue because our next panel will bring before you three very distinguished government leaders who will also introduce a couple of their project partners to show how this activity is flourishing and is pushing its way out. Professor David Richardson, you're in this room. Wave, please. Thank you. Professor Richardson is a scholar and director of the Wilberforce Institute at Hull University in England. It's a very important season for you. After this formal program's over, we're going to see a Wilberforce video and talk about the Wilberforce movement. But I wanted to use our previous conversation as a segue to our next panel, because Professor Richardson visited us earlier this year and was gracious to tell us about the 2200th anniversary events surrounding the Wilberforce and Britain's abolishing slavery. And as a courtesy and as a relationship-building exercise, we brought before you some of the United States government officials that are working on modern-day slavery and other civil society leaders. And I'll never forget, actually, this esteemed leader's expression on his face when he heard our story. When he heard how the United States government, the President of the United States, and federal officials are in action. And I hope it's not out of school to say that Professor Richardson's response was, "I had no idea." Scholars don't like to have to say that, actually. They have no idea. But he didn't, I didn't, sitting around that table. Others didn't by definition, because oftentimes we operate sort of in our own space. But it was an amazing presentation that the United States government is reaching pretty far into this problem and solving great need, and that's what you're about to hear. And to give that context and leadership, I would like to introduce first Ambassador Mark Lagan, who was appointed to his post in February of 2007, but who brings into his experience a long and distinguished career in foreign service. He was at the State Department in 2 previous posts, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations, and then also at State and on the Hill, and very important policy forming roles, foreign policy roles for the United States government. And Georgetown and Harvard, also someone who's very credentialed, but also someone, as you'll hear, who has a big heart for this work as well. What the ambassador will do is describe to you some of the broader angle view of the United States government role, and then Grace Becker, Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice, and Brent Arell, Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Health and Human Service, will follow the ambassador's remarks, and they will talk about enforcement at Justice and care at HHS as a reflective view of the breadth of activity, the continuum of enforcement and care that the United States government is actively sponsoring. So with no further ado, Ambassador, please join me at the podium.
President Bush has said, "No one is fit to be a master, and no one deserves to be a slave." And it's in that spirit, recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every human life, that we gather today at the Compassion in Action Roundtable. And I really want to thank Jay Hine, Director of the White House's Office on Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, for leadership and repeatedly spotlighting the issue of human trafficking. And you have led incredible collaborative work, and you've been a great help in our fight. I look out, and I see many faces I have worked with and I know as part of the faith-based and broader NGO community, and some allies from Capitol Hill. You're really valued as part of the abolitionist movement, and that's what we are. As you all know, this year marks that 200th anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade in the British colonies, and it was indeed Christian British parliamentarian William Wilberforce whose faith informed an effort to start an abolitionist movement in the Parliament. While much has changed since the days of the transatlantic slave trade, one thing remains in common: a lie that's fueled the horrific chapter in history that was slavery back then and fuels slavery today. A belief that some people are less than human, and it lies at the root of sex trafficking and slave labor today. You each know well the sobering reality of modern-day slavery, and it's been eloquently captured by our friend Gary Haugen. I have to say I admire Gary all the more after seeing with my own eyes in Tamil Nadu, India, just last month, the advocacy for bonded laborers by his young IJM lawyers of faith. Now there's something we could use more of. Every day all over the world, including in the United States, people are coerced into bonded labor, they're bought and sold in prostitution, they're exploited in domestic servitude, they're enslaved in agricultural work or in sweatshops, in factories, and indeed they're recruited unlawfully to be child soldiers. These are faces of human trafficking. Victims of sex trafficking and labor slavery include both foreign nationals and U.S. citizens, both women and men, both children and adults. Human traffickers prey on the vulnerable, regardless of their nationality, their gender, their age. And it's not just poverty and desperation that causes the victimization, but let's face it, the trafficker's evil, which causes this. Human trafficking is a bit of a jargon term. Trafficking is not only, as the word might suggest, about moving across borders. It's chiefly about extreme exploitation, total control over people's lives. A few weeks ago, I met a 24-year-old woman from Nepal who was working as a domestic servant in Kuwait. She'd been beaten and had numerous bite marks all over her arms and her back from a sadistic woman who felt the impunity to treat her as no human being ought to be treated. She was simply a slave in her employer's house. And let's face it, that is evil, and it must be abolished. Wilberforce himself was a poignant reminder of the essential role of people of faith, like many in this room, playing a key role in combating injustices throughout history, slavery foremost among them. In the year 2000, a remarkable and diverse coalition, a movement, including the faith-based community, coalesced to pass the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And it created the office I now lead, thankfully. I saw this coalition in action since I played a bit part as a staffer for Senator Helms and the enactment of that legislation. And that movement since has launched U.S. leadership, positively touching countless lives. Since that time, over 100 countries have passed comprehensive laws against human trafficking or amended their existing laws, and thousands of criminals around the world who weren't prosecuted just 5 years ago are being held to account in jail. But it's nowhere near enough. Our leadership on the issue hasn't only been rhetorical. In the last fiscal year 2006, the United States spent $73 million on 154 programs in some 70 countries to combat human trafficking. In the last 6 years, we've spent some $450 million, $50 million of which was in a dedicated initiative launched by President Bush. And this funding goes to specific, diverse programs like helping Persian Gulf states working to draft legislation that will shut down the vulnerability of slave labor, to assistance to an NGO which is expanding business operations for victims of sex trafficking in Cambodia, so that they don't just make charming crafts, but indeed are working for businesses that are self-sustaining and can have a future. My office is probably best known for the annual report, the Trafficking in Persons report, which examines how countries are doing on protection of victims, on prosecution of the exploiters, and on prevention through public awareness. And it's really an authoritative assessment of the global trends on human trafficking, and importantly, it's a diplomatic tool to prod other countries to improve. I have a conclusive example. Kuwait was leveraged by this report in recent weeks to open up a shelter that we have been pressing them to open. I saw it with my own eyes. Holding a spotlight up to the phenomenon helps. It really does. There's a crucial nexus between what we do at home and what we do abroad to combat human trafficking. It's especially apparent when I travel abroad. In our diplomacy with foreign governments, we can't just deliver sermons. We have to show that the United States is working on this problem too, and thankfully we are. We have much to share. I always talk about what we're doing at home. Victim identification, rescue of victims, police training, sensitizing judges. While the nature of trafficking varies from country to country, there are some basic commonalities from India to Indiana. Foremost among them is that victims typically do not come forward and identify themselves. They are scared. They are scared that they will be treated as dirty. They are scared that they will be treated as criminals. They are scared that they will be treated as illegal aliens. To help them, we have to find them first. We're creating models at home that can be emulated abroad. Our task forces, for example, one of which you'll hear about later in our program from my colleagues, reflect the collaboration that can occur between federal authorities, local law enforcement, NGOs, healthcare providers, civil society actors being vital. I've seen this with my own eyes in Nashville, and I will be leading a group of foreign ambassadors to Los Angeles to show them how we do it soon. That collaboration has to happen within the federal government too. And I am lucky to chair an interagency group, and just tomorrow we're having our cabinet level meeting of the Presidential Interagency Task Force on Trafficking, bringing together some 10 departments and agencies of the government, and you'll hear from some of them shortly. At the heart of the U.S. government effort to end human trafficking is very simply a commitment to human dignity. And as Jay referred to, it's not just a desire to rescue people, but to restore their lives, restore hope and restore a possibility for a full life. Our partners in the faith-based community and the NGO community are best equipped to do this. And we in government have much to learn from them. This spring, my office hopes to host a seminar which will bring together faith-based NGOs to share best practices and lessons learned, seeking ways to mobilize more NGOs and local communities to engage in this work. Today's roundtable is not the culmination of U.S. government efforts to collaborate with faith-based community. It's indicative of the vibrant and expanding partnership between government and actors outside the government. And so with that, it's now my pleasure to introduce Heidi Metcalf, who's Vice President of Geneva Global. Geneva Global is a for-profit organization that connects thoughtful investors with effective programs in areas such as health, human rights, and economic empowerment. I'm personally very interested not just in encouraging the invaluable partnerships that we have to do the work on the ground to help victims of human trafficking, but another important kind of partnership, partnerships to directly support the work on the ground with private philanthropic giving. Remember, this is a function of our unique American ethos and spirit, and the private philanthropic funding dwarfs government spending, and it needs to in human trafficking because as yet it doesn't. Geneva Global is at the forefront of strategic philanthropic giving, and its willingness to engage on the most vexing human rights issues like human trafficking is reflective of a larger trend in the corporate world, one which we hope to see grow. So Heidi Metcalf, welcome.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for your service, and Jay for bringing us together today, and certainly for the President for his leadership in this area. As I have traveled around the world and visited anti-human trafficking and anti-slavery efforts really on almost all of the continents on the globe, one of the things that has struck me is how evil, and we've talked about it this morning and you all know it, how evil is at work and how destructive the evil is. And I, like many of you, have struggled with where is the hope in that. And as I've thought about that, and since we're at a faith-based and community initiatives gathering, maybe this is appropriate to use a scriptural allusion, but goodness wins in the end. I believe that goodness wins in the end, and that then, therefore, there is a destructive power of good, and God says to Moses, my goodness is gonna pass in front of you, and you can't see it because it would destroy you. So as we come together today, I want to tell you about one little piece of that destructive power of good through a private sector innovation that's working to leverage private philanthropy to resource community and faith-based organizations fighting slavery. So Geneva Global is focused on the private philanthropic market. We want to be the most effective intermediary of philanthropic capital in the world. And our mission is to promote prosperity among the poor by connecting investors to the most effective life-changing programs in the world. Again, we focus on the private philanthropic market, which is a $290 billion, largely non-rational capital market. A rational philanthropic investor looking for the greatest return on their investment would be drawn to the community and faith-based organizations in the developing world. It's simply the biggest bang for your buck out there. But of course, there are barriers to really connect with those community and faith-based organizations. There's opacity of information, there's mistrust, there's a lack of information. And Geneva Global serves as an intermediary, providing our clients with project identification and origination services, due diligence, grants management, and performance management. And our clients are high net worth individuals, corporations, and foundations, and then we work with governments to broker public-private partnerships for our clients that are interested. Geneva Global sits right in that space between the donor, the implementer, and the beneficiary. And since 2000, we've seen almost 6 million lives changed as a result of the granting of our clients and the important work of this community and faith-based organizations on the ground. This is through $60 million in grants to 1,400 projects in 114 different countries, through a worldwide network of 125 staff and a project origination network of 600 different people. And we work in 6 sectors of expertise. Now, you might be saying, that's a really interesting donor model. What does that have to do with what we're here to talk about today? Well, I mentioned we have 6 sectors of expertise. One of those 6 sectors is human liberty. Since 2003, Geneva Global has brokered over $4 million to 104 community-based efforts addressing slavery and human trafficking in 30 different countries and positively impacting over 450,000 lives. Now, to put this in context, between 2002 and 2005, there was about $11 billion granted from the top 100 foundations in the U.S. Just $1 million was given to anti-trafficking efforts. So $4 million is actually pretty sizable. Now, our focus is on private philanthropy, and I mentioned we broker PPPs for clients interested in leverage and the benefits of partnering with governments. And our first PPP was with the Global Development Alliance at USAID, and it's this project that I want to highlight because of the incredible efforts produced by community and faith-based organizations and the example of public and private entities coming together, both bringing their best to the table. There's a copy of a DVD you can pick up outside that will talk more about this, but let me just talk for a couple of minutes about this project in Ecuador that was a public-private partnership between USAID and a private donor. In the external context, we had an eager donor who was a private client, private equity venture capitalist. There was external pressure. Ecuador had come on the Global Trafficking in Persons Tier 3 watch list, so there was an incentivized local mission, and Geneva Global served as a flexible, results-driven intermediary. It was a $600,000 partnership. This wasn't a lot of money, half from the private sector, half from the government. 11 community and faith-based organizations came together and began to respond to what they considered an invisible problem. We had to create experts. There was no one in Ecuador working in trafficking. So we assembled groups working in related fields and leveraged the technical assistance of our sector expertise as well as USAID to address a problem that was particularly occurring in indigenous communities, focused on prevention, rescue, rehabilitation, and legislation change. Let me just give you a quick snapshot of some of the results. In prevention, 325,000 people learned about the dangers of trafficking, and the majority of those were mobilized to teach others. 4,000 victims received skills training in how to legitimately earn a living, as well as children and women receiving personalized psychological and medical care. There was an institutional impact. The partnership left a legacy of a network of diverse organizations that came together. They had a common funder, a big problem, a window of opportunity, and in addition to changing individual lives, the implementers founded and convened by this PPP created a national plan to combat trafficking that was a result of their network. And finally, there was systemic change or government action. There was no penal code in Ecuador. In the penal code in Ecuador, there was no penalty for sexual exploitation. What emerged from the efforts of this network was the statute creating the system to control and monitor sexual exploitation of boys, girls, and adolescents for commercial purposes. There were some lessons learned and some real key takeaways. And the first is that, and I could talk for hours on the project, so I encourage you to pick up the DVD, but let me give you a couple of takeaways. Community and faith-based organizations were absolutely critical in this initiative because of their reach and their trust, and they were able to act a lot more quickly than anyone else would have in a one-year program. It didn't take a lot of money, but it took some smart money that was well allocated and well coordinated. And the monitoring and capacity building of Geneva as an intermediary as well as the local mission was absolutely critical in this context where there was no best practice understanding of the implementers. And finally, this was really attractive to private donors. In addition to the initial cornerstone investor, we attracted another $400,000 to this initiative and even doubled the local investment there. So I want to encourage you all in your work, as well as in your creative thinking. Sometimes the best way for people to have an impact in this area is to give, but let's encourage people to give smartly and give towards results and not just to need. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Grace Chung Becker. I'm a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division, and I oversee the human trafficking program that we have at the Department of Justice. First, let me also add my appreciation to Jay Hahn for organizing this. This is the second event that I attended. I've also attended the Wilberforce event several months ago, and I can't tell you how important it is for us to have this opportunity to speak to you. It is an honor and a privilege to tell you today about the work that we're doing in the Civil Rights Division. The fight against human trafficking, as you all know, is a priority of the President of the United States. It's also a priority of the Attorney General of the Justice Department. And we have taken an comprehensive, robust, and aggressive strategy that includes infiltration of the dark places of prostitution, that includes rescue of victims, and prosecution of perpetrators. We have created in the Civil Rights Division a human trafficking prosecution unit. This is an elite cadre of experienced civil rights lawyers who go out and who train other prosecutors, others law enforcement, who go out and investigate and prosecute human trafficking cases and work closely with non-governmental organizations who are partners in this fight against human trafficking. We also coordinate very closely with 42 DOJ-funded multidisciplinary task forces. And what these task forces are, they're led by a U.S. attorney in the area, but the funding goes to state and local law enforcement. And included as part of the task forces are NGOs, and some of you out there I know are participating in some of them. These are important because one of the biggest challenges that we have, of course, is finding the victims. You know, a lot of these victims that we see are illegal immigrants, so they're not going to be knocking on the door of the FBI or ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. A lot of them may be engaged in illegal conduct like prostitution, so again, they're not going to be going forward to law enforcement. The people that are most likely to come in contact with these individuals are NGOs. They may run away and they may go to a church. They may run away, they may go to another non-governmental organization. And that's why it's imperative for us to reach out to you and so that you can be our eyes and ears on the ground. What we have developed by creating this multidisciplinary task force is a victim-centered approach. Our first priority as law enforcement is to rescue the victim. When we go in to raid a brothel, we already have in place relationships with NGOs. It takes a tremendous amount of planning. But the most important thing is to take these victims away from the brothel, to provide them shelter, a hotel room, so that they don't have to be incarcerated, to provide them clothing, because the only clothing they may have is the clothing that's on their back, clothing that they may not have chosen for themselves to wear. And of course, food. Some of these victims may have children, and so they need care for their children as well. So that is our first priority, food, clothing, and shelter. And we rely, again, very heavily with our NGO partners in trying to provide that restorative care. We also, for some of our foreign victims, provide immigration relief, allowing them to remain here in the United States legally so they don't have to worry about getting deported, helping them to get their work visas. And again, we partner with NGOs who help provide some of the legal services to get there. And we provide certifications and supporting documents for that. And then after we have met their needs, after we've rescued them, then we do multiple interviews with these victims. As you can imagine, it takes time to build a rapport, to establish trust with victims who fear law enforcement. And so we are very patient. We know that the first interview is not always going to be the most enlightening. But through patience, through hard work, we are able to get these victims to trust us, oftentimes working through translators, so that they can share the horrific events that occurred to them so that we can put these perpetrators behind bars. Now, while many of the victims are foreigners, and we've heard some stories about foreign victims, I want to briefly talk to you about a case that we brought involving U.S. citizen victims, because I don't want anyone to leave the room today thinking that this only happens in faraway places. It happens right here, right now, in any place, anywhere, as I said, and any vulnerable victim. We recently, at the end of August, prosecuted a case called United States versus Jimmy Jones. This is in the Atlanta area. This is a man who preyed on college students. U.S. citizen college students, told them that he was going to get them into modeling, had them sign modeling contracts, including their social security number as part of the contracts, agreeing to pay him a monthly fee to act as their agent. And he conned these women because he had somebody with him who had gotten some modeling work, and so they believed him. And then, of course, he told them, well, you really need to feel comfortable with your body. And so we're going to take some nude photos of you, or we're going to have you dancing in a strip club. And then he would use that as blackmail against these women, saying, well, if you don't agree to prostitution, I'm going to use these pictures, I'm going to send them to your parents, or send them to your boyfriend. He then, because he had their social security numbers, could also toy with their credit. And if that didn't work, brute force. This man represented himself at trial, but as the trial was getting started, he decided he was going to plead guilty. So Jimmy Jones has been prosecuted, but we've seen other cases too, just in Connecticut, for example, in United States versus Paris, a sex trafficking ring involving both adult victims and a 14-year-old U.S. citizen girl. Now, I have a 10-year-old daughter at home. She's just a few years away. I would never want to see anything like this happen to her. But as I said, we can't do this without your help. And again, I can't emphasize enough, our biggest challenge is to find the victims. And we need your help out there to provide the restorative care, to be our eyes and ears. And also, as part of civil society, to provide awareness-raising information to additional personnel who might be able to provide information about possible victimization. We've really tried to think out of the box here. We've identified 35 vocations, from alcohol and beverage control board personnel, to wage and hour inspectors, to emergency room doctors who have referred cases to our task forces. We get about over a third of our cases from NGOs. And so we need your help. But I'm proud to say that the efforts we've done so far have been very, very successful. From FY01 to FY06, the number of cases that we've opened up has increased by 600%. And for the last fiscal year that just ended, FY07, we have set record high numbers in the number of defendants that we've convicted. And this is the 4th year in a row that we've set those numbers. So we keep setting records, breaking our own record, breaking them again, and then breaking them again. So I know that while we have successes, there's still more victims out there, and we need your help. And I want to mention today one of our partners, Polaris Project, who you'll be hearing from next. Catherine Chan, who is a graduate of Brown University, is the co-founder and executive director of Polaris Project, and her bio is in the program. But let me briefly say that it's important to have partners like Polaris and others helping us by participating as members in our trafficking task forces, keeping track of states that have passed anti-trafficking laws, which is something that the Polaris Project has done for us, and conducted detailed field studies on sex trafficking. So without further ado, here's Ms. Chan.
Thank you. I have bronchitis, so hopefully I'll last for the talk. I am so happy to be here. Gary, I am very thankful for your remarks. When Gary started off reminding us back to the heart of the mission that binds all of us together, it really touched me because there are so many people in this room today, from the government to grassroots organizations, individuals, academic researchers, and we all have strengths that we're bringing to the table. But it's the heart that I think helps us to prevent burnout and helps us to sustain our own energy to continue the fight, because the traffickers, they count on ignorance from the community, silence from the community, burnout from the community, giving up. And I'm really glad to be here together with you because we are sending a message that in this room and across the country and around the world, that we're all talking about partnerships and collaborations across all sectors and disciplines. And I really appreciate that theme that so many speakers have brought up already. The message of heart is very core to Polaris Project. We're not a faith-based organization, but we are very much a community-based organization. That's how we were founded. Grace mentioned that I am a graduate of Brown University. During my senior year, trying to figure out what to do with my life, where my passions may take me, there came a moment when a few friends and I had a conversation about the abolitionist movement of the past. And we talk of William Wilberforce and the abolitionists in the United States. And we had a very fiery debate on the ethics around the abolitionist movement at the time. Why were some people on the side of promoting and sustaining the system of slavery that was helping the economy in the South? Why were others leading the charge for abolitionism? And surprisingly, there were various sides of this relatively philosophical debate. And all of a sudden, the conversation turned to, well, what about modern day slavery? And that's when we started hearing about people reading things in the newspaper about 12-year-old girls in Cambodia, 10-year-old girls in India, bonded laborers in India. And I think what hit home for us, and it brings us back to community, was when we picked up a local newspaper article, and there was a story about 6 women from South Korea. And at the time, this was before Congress passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. But the way the reporter wrote about the law enforcement investigation, the detective went in. The 6 women were recruited by the girlfriend of the owner of this brothel that was fronted as a massage parlor. They were forced into prostitution, had their documents confiscated, were not allowed to leave, had cigar burns on their arms. And this was happening in tiny little Providence, Rhode Island, where we were attending school at the time. And that's when it hit home. That's when we realized this, of course, globally is our community, but human trafficking is happening every single day in the cities and towns that we live in, including here in Washington, D.C. And when we, as college students, had questions about what can we do as an individual, there was so little space at the time for community members to take action. So that's why we created Polaris Project. So quickly, just to give you a sense of what difference one individual can make, because people ask us all the time. When we moved to DC, the very first case we had, again, opened up a newspaper article, 2 Asian women put into a massage parlor from China, and the way the newspaper article read, it was almost a direct replication of what we read in that Providence, Rhode Island article. But this time, we could do something. Before, in that case, all the women were deported. No one knew it was human trafficking, although the detective described it as slave-like conditions. This time, we called up the local authorities, said what we did, talked to their defense attorney, and ended up working with a woman where one of the women safely repatriated back to her home country. The other was able to receive a T visa, has her family, just called me up last Christmas. She's starting up her own small business. So that is the power of an individual. And every single day we hear daily stories of individuals. I know Kathleen Davis is here. She's part of our fellowship program, which is our leadership development wing of what we do to build up others in the community as well. And she is this one-woman show who went knocking on the doors of state legislators saying, here in Ohio, in my home community, here's this research report that I created and found on human trafficking, and now state legislators are actively working, and there's a task force there as well. Here in Washington, D.C., 5 years ago, we felt so alone, but now we have the partnership of a very active DC task force on human trafficking, where there are protocols in place, there are hotlines in place on the victim identification side. On the victim service side, you'll hear more from the Department of Health and Human Services and USCCB, but it feels so great to know, yes, this is a dark, ugly, global and local problem, but oh my goodness, it feels so good not to be alone in this, and that we are working together. And as the movement grows, hopefully our bonds and our partnership will strengthen, and we won't let the evil and the traffickers and human nature be divisive in this movement. So with that, I would just like to show my appreciation for all of you in this room and all those partners around the world in this country who are taking a very active fight and a voice and taking it to the Hill and helping the victims within our midst in our home communities every day. Thank you very much.
Well, I think you can see from that presentation why Polaris Project is one of our favorite organizations at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In fact, earlier this year, we awarded a grant to Polaris to become our national technical assistance provider for all of our contractors and grantees who are working on human trafficking programs, and also to help us begin to think about how to develop a national clearinghouse. So great remarks. Thank you so much. Very inspiring. And from the government standpoint, I can also say it's good to know that we are not alone in trying to address this either, so thank you. I also wanted to thank my colleagues from DOJ for their comments, and Ambassador Lagon too. They're providing tremendous leadership on this issue. Particularly from the justice standpoint, I think we at HHS recognize that there is a potentially unlimited supply of victims. You know, we tend to focus on, all right, somebody's been victimized, so what can we do to help them recover from what's happened to them? And so we focus on that. That's what we think about. But we know that because we have this potentially unlimited supply of victims, we need tough, aggressive prosecutions. All of the work that has to be done to shut this down permanently. It's not good enough just to be taking people out of the stream constantly. We have to do more to make sure that we stop the stream. And that work that DOJ is engaged in is just terribly important, and we want to do everything we can to support it, cooperate with it. I also want to thank Jay, who a year ago was my boss and is a great man. I can tell you that he actually tries to incarnate his values and carry them into everything that he does. And that's why sessions like this are being pulled together. He really believes in the work of faith and community-based organizations. He really believes in the compassion and effectiveness that these kinds of organizations bring to the way that government operates. And it was an honor to work with him, and it's an honor to be affiliated with him now. It is always a privilege to be here in the Eisenhower Executive Office building. My real vocation is as an historian. If I could sit home and read history books all day, I probably would. Many great leaders have graced these halls. Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt had offices on the floors below us, and so did the building's namesake. Harry Truman held press conferences in the Indian Treaty Room that you're going to be going to later today for the reception. And as the State War and Navy building, it was here that the United States planned and implemented the strategies that preserved the freedom of the world during the Great Wars. You are part of that stream of history and in fighting for human freedom today. So it's an honor to be with you. All of us are gathered here because we share the belief that slavery, and that's what it is, slavery is an affront to human dignity that must not be allowed within the borders of the freest country in the world. and it must not be allowed within the borders of any country. We're here because we are committed to fighting human bondage and to helping its victims rebuild their lives. Our mission at the Office of Refugee Resettlement at the Administration for Children and Families is to identify and to provide services to the survivors of human trafficking and conduct anti-trafficking public awareness with the ultimate goal of shutting down the modern slave trade and bringing its perpetrators to justice while also caring for the victims. But as you know, eliminating human trafficking is an enormous task. We live in a continent-sized nation of over 300 million people. Searching for those trapped and concealed by captors in a web of human trafficking in a land so immense is a vast, complicated task, and it's not incomparable, in my view, to finding the proverbial needle in the haystack. Accordingly, we cannot achieve our goals single-handedly. So in 2004, we launched the Rescue and Restore Victims of Human Rights Trafficking campaign. This initiative forms a network of care that spans the country, encompasses federal, state, and city governments, healthcare professionals, law enforcement officials, lawyers, concerned citizens, and social services providers of all sizes. We all have vital roles to play in this alliance, and community and faith-based organizations are an important part of this coalition. They form the front line of the battle against human trafficking. These entities often operate under the radar and on streets where government presence is minimal and funding is scarce. Organizations such as St. Matthew's House, a transition home that offers food, shelter, and spiritual support for the homeless in Naples, Florida, as an example. Right now, St. Matthew's is providing refuge to 15 trafficking victims and children. But St. Matthew's offers much more than beds and food. They offer counseling and education that allows survivors of slavery a chance to recover and rebuild their lives. It is providers such as these that most often come in contact with victims and are best equipped to assist them directly. But these small faith and community-based organizations often struggle to compete for government support. To remedy this, ACF is pursuing two complementary strategies. First, we are partnering with contractors, often in the form of mid-sized non-governmental organizations, who in turn work with our grassroots partners to build their capacity and to make sure that federal dollars are used effectively and efficiently. These contractors are regionally focused and are implementing programs that are tailored to the specific trafficking problems of the communities that they serve. They function as intermediaries between the federal programs and local organizations, and they ensure that agents of care such as St. Matthew's House, which are so vital in furnishing the aid that victims of trafficking need, get the technical assistance they need to expand and improve their services. Second, we're partnering with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in the form of a per capita victim services contract designed to provide flexible, anytime, anywhere, high-level care to trafficking victims. The contract also streamlines support services in order to help victims gain timely access to shelter, legal assistance, job training, and health care, and establish new lives free of violence. The man for whom this building is named, Dwight Eisenhower, once said, "Freedom has its life in the hearts and the actions and the spirit of men." We are here today because in our hearts, actions, and spirits, we share a common commitment to freedom and human dignity. But though we have a common commitment and shared goals, our focuses, roles, and responsibilities are often different. These differences can unite us. When we bring our diverse approaches together through innovative collaborations and new coalitions, we can achieve our objectives. We can bring traffickers to the bar of justice and bring compassion and care to their victims. No single agency, organization, or office can do this alone. But together, we can accomplish all of these things. I mentioned just a second ago that ACF has a contract with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to oversee a network of service providers who work with trafficking victims. One of our most important partners in this collaboration is here today. As Director of Refugee Programs, Migration Services at the USCCB, Anastasia Brown is responsible for the oversight and supervision of all services to trafficking victims and refugees resettled through the Catholic network in the United States. And by the way, that's 25% of all the refugees that come into our country. This is an immense task, but there's no one better suited to it than Anastasia. For over 15 years, she has worked on behalf of human trafficking victims both in the U.S. and abroad. She brings experience and commitment to her work that few can match, and we at ACF are truly pleased to call her a friend and colleague. Please welcome Anastasia Brown.
Thank you, sir. On behalf of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, I would like to thank the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives for this opportunity to highlight the importance of addressing this horrific crime in human trafficking, and to show how our mission to serve the vulnerable in society is aided through collaboration with the federal government. The crime of human trafficking affects more than an individual. Traffickers victimize and demoralize the global community. Victims are not the only ones that need restoration. Our society needs restoration. The United States has recognized this and is mobilizing its efforts to combat human trafficking through prevention, prosecution, and protection. The government cannot do this alone. Government agencies value and recognize the need for faith-based and community programs. We bring infrastructure, capacity, skills, and compassion. The Catholic Church continues to reaffirm its historic concern on the issues of forced labor and sexual exploitation. This commitment is rooted in the gospel mandate that every person is to be welcomed as if they were Christ himself. As His Holiness Pope John Paul II stated, human trafficking constitutes a shocking offense against human dignity and a great violation of fundamental human rights. As a global institution, the Catholic Church is well positioned to identify, rescue, and serve the victims of human trafficking. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the church community throughout the nation have placed combating human trafficking as a top priority, focusing on advocacy, education, and service delivery. USCCB is one of the founding members of the Catholic Coalition Against Human Trafficking, consisting of around 20 Catholic organizations. And the coalition convenes to work on advocacy, public education, and outreach. Members were very important voices in influencing the provisions of the Trafficking Victims and Protection Act of 2000 and its subsequent reauthorization. And we are working together now on issues of concern in the current reauthorization. But additionally, USCCB has helped in fulfilling its mission to serve this vulnerable population through federal funding from the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Refugee Resettlement, and the Department of Justice, Office for Victims of Crime. USCCB utilizes a national capacity and experience to oversee the provision of comprehensive case management services to victims of trafficking. Since the passage of the TVPA, we have provided services to survivors, placed trafficked children into care, conducted outreach, education, training, and technical assistance. To date, USCCB, through the various programs, has served over 900 victims of trafficking from 68 countries. Under our contract with the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement, we oversee the provision of comprehensive case management to victims by training, assisting, and funding Catholic and non-Catholic social service organizations nationwide, including the U.S. territories. To date, we have 85 subcontractors in 42 states, covering 115 locations in the U.S. Case management services include access to social services, legal, criminal justice and employment assistance, health and mental health services, English language training, housing, and other material needs. But core to this program is our provision of technical assistance and training to service providers and others, such as law enforcement, lawyers, therapists, to enhance their ability to serve victims of trafficking. Trafficking cases are one of the most complex and challenging types of work encountered. It really takes a team of people to serve one case. Trafficking victims are identified throughout the United States in rural and urban settings. It is impossible to predict where a victim will be identified. But when a person is identified, the per capita service mechanism enables the community to care for that victim. The case management design and the per capita service program evolved over the past several years to deliver standardized but client-tailored services to victims of trafficking anywhere and anytime they are identified, regardless of the social service or legal agency's experience with human trafficking. Our model provides technical assistance and training needed for communities across the U.S. to deliver similar services regardless of the local agency's level of previous expertise. Just between the months of May and September of this year, USCCB has provided training 33 times to 1,065 individuals and technical assistance to over 500 individuals, with another 30 hours on legal and mental health issues alone. By monitoring cases nationwide, USCCB is able to identify best practices, statistical trends, and challenges, and we share this information with the subcontractors and the government agencies as a means to improve the delivery of services and the protection for the victims. To illustrate the way the program operates, I'd like to share the story of a family, an entire family, who was being held in captivity here in the United States. The family was identified in a rural location by an attorney who had applied for immigration relief on their behalf, leading to their certification as victims of trafficking. And this allowed them access to public benefits. We were notified by the Department of Health and Human Services about the family, but the closest per capita provider was 3 hours away. We identified the only service provider in the rural community, recruited that agency to become a subcontractor to serve this family. The agency had no experience in serving trafficking victims or other foreign-born populations. And as a result, they did not initially understand the family's service needs. Due to cultural misunderstandings, the family declined assistance. We worked providing training and technical assistance to the agency on how to go about delivering culturally sensitive services to this traumatized family. The agency was successful in re-engaging the family, tailoring services to meet their needs, and was able to serve the same model of comprehensive case management provided by other subcontractors in different states. Through the funding that we have with the Department of Justice, Office for Victims of Crime, we also are able to provide this model in 2 areas of the country, but are also engaged in outreach to identify the victims. Those programs train service providers, law enforcement, and key community personnel, coordinate service capacity, provide case management services to the victim, coordinate coalition efforts, and collaborate with law enforcement and anti-trafficking task force. The global community, including the United States, is really only beginning to comprehend the scope and impact of modern-day slavery. I would like to quote a recent statement of Bishop Gerald Barnes, the chair of the U.S. Catholic Conference's Committee on Migration. We must work together, church, state, and community, to eliminate the root causes and markets which permit traffickers to flourish, to make whole the survivors of this crime, and to ensure that one day soon, trafficking in human persons vanishes from the face of the earth once and for all. Thank you.
This is the last time you'll see me, I promise. I mentioned that the per capita contract the USCCB oversees for us is one of our strategies. The second one is the use of intermediary contracts. One of those contracts is with the Florida Coalition Against Human Trafficking, an entity that provides care to survivors of human trafficking and education to law enforcement officials and community organizations working on trafficking cases in Florida. The president of the Florida Coalition is Anna Rodriguez, and she's here with us today. For well over a decade, Anna has tirelessly provided support to and advocated for human trafficking victims. From victim shelters to the Collier County Sheriff's Office to the courtrooms of the Southern District of Florida, she has led the way to establish a vital link between law enforcement officials and victims. And for her selfless devotion to our cause, Anna has been widely recognized and commended in print and documentaries and by President Bush, who has recognized her dedication to helping victims. It is through the dedicated and courageous work of leaders such as Anna that we will bring human trafficking to an end. Please join me in welcoming Anna Rodriguez.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the White House Community, Faith-Based and Community Agency for bringing us together here. It's great to see old faces and new faces. When I started with human trafficking in 1999, I was working with law enforcement. And it was very difficult because here we are finding victims, but we didn't know what to do with them. We had no idea who to call. We had no idea what agency would provide services. When we tried working with some of the agencies, they didn't know anything about trafficking, so their doors were always shut. 2004, I basically decided to finish my law enforcement career and retired, and founded the Florida Coalition Against Human Trafficking with zero funding. It was only my savings. I pay my dues. For almost a year and a half, I was traveling throughout the state of Florida, bringing my story. This is how I found a victim of trafficking. This is human trafficking. We in the state of Florida need to be aware about the situation that we have. I am pleased to say that today the Florida Coalition has offices all over the state of Florida. We have offices in the Panhandle. We have offices in Jacksonville, Tampa, Orlando, Miami, and our headquarters is in Bonita Springs. Out of one person, little office, we have now a staff and volunteers of 19. So we have grown, but the most important thing is that we have been able to find victims and provide assistance to these victims. The strategy of the Florida Coalition Against Human Trafficking was to identify, rescue, and restore their lives, developing support from community grassroots and faith-based organizations. We wanted to identify who may service the needs of human trafficking victims, offering trainings and presentations to create awareness, develop capacity among Florida Coalition partners and community at large. Law enforcement, collaboration, and partnership, it is very, very important component for a successful case. We at FCAT have been able to partner with local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies throughout the state of Florida. We have been able to assist potential victims after a raid. We are part of a staging area where victims are brought by law enforcement to be interviewed. This program has been very successful, and victims have been able to receive immediate care and services without delays. Facilitate subcontracts to help partners. Funding thanks to the Department of Health and Human Services intermediary contract. Help us provide financial support to community grassroots and faith-based agencies, which in turn expand outreach and services throughout the state of Florida. Let me give you an example. The Florida Coalition Against Human Trafficking developed a partnership and issue an intermediary subcontract with Confia, a grassroots faith-based organization in Orlando, Florida. Through Confia, training was hosted by Christian Care Center. The audience was over 50, included faith-based organization and representatives from Spanish media. During the training, the Spanish media representative recognized that they knew of a potential human trafficking case. After further discussion, it was discovered that a major case involving 105 Puerto Ricans were potential victims of labor trafficking. As a follow-up, this case is now under local and federal investigation. Later, because due to the situation, I traveled to Puerto Rico, invited by the President of the Senate of Puerto Rico, and now we are collaborating with them in the creation of a human trafficking task force and a rescue and restore coalition in Puerto Rico. Another example is a 16-year-old mother of a 9-month-old baby that was branded by the trafficker. She was 6 months pregnant, was rescued and sheltered at a teen pregnancy house that we also fund through our subcontract funding. When she turned 18, she couldn't stay there anymore. She aged out and she had to find another shelter. Another 20-year-old victim that was found was not able to find housing or shelter. We were not able to find shelter because she had a baby, a 6-month-old baby that is extremely ill and won't make it to the age of 1. We have had many more experiences like this that demonstrate the need for adequate housing to provide emergency and transition shelter that meets the specific needs of human trafficking victims. With funded, provided by our intermediary contract with HHS, we have been able to partner and subcontract with St. Matthew's House in Naples and Families First in Jacksonville to provide housing, assist our case managers, offer transportation, daycare, medical appointments, and financial literacy. Without this contract funding, we could not provide these victims with a shelter they can call home. As of today, we have 25 victims sheltered under this subcontract program. Out of state, we have 24 additional victims that we have placed with relatives due to lack of rooms in Florida. We also have partner and subcontract with Claus Kids in Pensacola to provide outreach and community awareness and education. Claus Kids has been able to identify areas in Pensacola where potential domestic and international victims are. Thanks to the partnership with Claus Kids, we have been able to identify 4 domestic trafficking victims and provide services to 24 Guatemalan labor victims from Panama City that have been relocated to Mobile, Alabama for safety reasons. Brad Dennis, the director of Claus Kids, has been present during the interviews with ICE and has been able to provide them with care packages and referral to services. Thanks to the contract, we have also been able to hire victim specialists and open offices in the Jacksonville, Clearwater, Tampa, Miami area, but also thanks to Salvation Army, because through their partnership, we have been able to secure office space to be able to open these sites and be able to work these communities. Shalimar, Florida, in the Panhandle, we have partnered with law enforcement where now we have a victim specialist from the Florida Coalition inside the Sheriff's Department. So working side by side with the law enforcement agents that has been assigned to human trafficking. We have subcontracted with with 25 grassroots, community, and faith-based agencies in Florida. Additionally, we have partnered with over 56 agencies in Florida, including consulates and government officials of Guatemala, Argentina, Mexico, Puerto Rico, and soon Dominican Republic. Thanks to the assistance from Argentina, we have initiated, because of their referral, communications with the consulate of Uruguay and Paraguay, so that when we find victims, we're able to provide them with the services. We have 12 agencies in Northwest Florida, Central Florida, and Southeast Florida that are on a waiting list to be considered for a subcontract with FCAT to provide outreach, awareness, and education. This is as a result of our successful program. And just to close, I also would like to announce that as of Friday, due to the work that we have been doing with the government of Argentina, Argentina now officially has a human trafficking coalition. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. I am Elizabeth Wiebe. I work in the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives and extend my welcome to you. It's my privilege to introduce our last few speakers. We have heard such a great deal about amazing partnerships going on with both faith-based and community organizations and our government counterparts, how this is spreading. You can almost see it like ripples in a pond and how it's getting larger and larger. And how we would like to end today is to highlight some innovative examples of public awareness and training efforts that are going on. None of us can sit here and not think, am I doing enough and what can I do next? And I know that for this group, that's like preaching to the choir. You all have been involved in this for years. You could all come up and add to the value of this forum with your own highlights of your own programs. Watching you all come in and see each other from across the room and see partnerships and talk was like Old Home Week and a reunion of people who are centered around this particular need. So we know that you have this fire in you already. So we'd like to just highlight a few of those examples. Americans hear about the great need that we've heard about, and inside of almost everyone, it can't help but stir up, am I sacrificing enough? What can I give? Whether it's an organization that we're involved in or just as an individual. And we're going to hear both sides of that this morning. I will let you know briefly that one of our speakers was not able to be with us. The illness, I think the plague that is going around all of us hit her especially hard. So we're especially sorry that former Congressman Linda Smith could not join us this morning. Her good work is highlighted in your program, both through her biography and through the information on her organization, Shared Hope International. And I have the privilege of reading a short message to us from her in her stead, as she is on her sickbed. Shared Hope International and I salute you for your enduring commitment and dedication to the fight against human trafficking. I have been immersed in this battle for the past decade, from working with many of you to secure passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, to growing Shared Hope International through partnerships with government and private organizations to increase public awareness in programs that rescue and restore girls around the world. It is with deepest regret that I am unable to join you today at this event and celebrate successes made by both faith-based and community groups everywhere. And that Shared Hope International is a great example of the innovative public awareness efforts that are going on today. So please stop by if you would. On your way out the table, there's information on Shared Hope. And if you did not get that massive amount of information that was being passed out, all of those things are out to your right as well. Without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Beth Grant. She is the co-founder of Project Rescue and also FAST Curriculum Project Leader. As you see in your program, FAST is the Faith Alliance Against Slavery and Trafficking. And I am going to let her talk about the great coalition that brings. Dr. Beth Grant.
Good morning. Would you like to stand a moment? I know how it is. I'm a teacher. Yes. As we stand, let me go ahead and thank Jay again, and you have been thanked by all of us, I think, but it's very appropriate. It's important that we share the horror. There is no worse face of evil. Yes, go ahead. Thank you. In 30 years in India, my husband and I have never seen a worse face of evil than this particular evil. And yet we are here today because we believe there is hope. Hope motivates. Hope lights a fire. And that's why we are here today. We are thankful for this opportunity, not only to share, but to listen to one another. Because as we hear so many times, those of us who are engaged in this issue, it's 24/7. We eat it, we sleep it, we drink it. It's our life. But it's important to take moments like today to hear from one another, to hear who is doing what. Many times we're working even in the same country, and we are so focused that we don't realize we have a brother or sister in the journey close by. Often, we would be stronger together. And that's one of the reasons I've come here today, is because I appreciate the coming together in this journey. It was 10 years ago, this summer, that our colleague K.K. Devaraj in Bombay, India, called us in the middle of the night. For the first time, he had taken his team of Bombay Teen Challenge workers into the red light district of Kamatapura. He discovered a world he did not know existed and opened a world to many of us that we did not know existed. What he found there was over 100 women and children in multi-story buildings, many with bars, imprisoned. working in sexual slavery, many of whom had been trafficked from Western Nepal's impoverished villages. That was a shock to us because many times in the West and in the church, we think of prostitution as a choice. But that night, a new world was open to us. He called us weeping. He said, Brother David, he said, we just went there. Here's what we've seen. And he said, as we began to share, and our workers were there, going down through these alleyways of darkness, he said over 100 women got word out of the brothels to us, saying, we want to leave. We hear your message of hope. We want to get out of this life, but we are not free to leave. We are slaves. But will you take our daughters? Because if you don't get our daughters out of here within weeks or months or years at the most, they also will be forced into this life and they will have no choices. So, Brother David, can we take 37 little girls? My husband, David, who's here this morning, who's a man of great vision, immediately said, of course, Devaraj, yes. Only later he goes, now how are we going to do this? But you see, friends, before we know it's one thing, but once we become aware, we have to act. Later, we developed a plan. But that was the beginning of the first Home of Hope with Project Rescue, Bombay Teen Challenge Partnership. And today, there are 11 Homes of Hope in India and Nepal with Project Rescue, HIV/AIDS clinics, vocational training, and prevention efforts in Western Nepal, where girls have been trafficked into brothels in India or into the courts of the kings for hundreds, if not thousands of years. This is a very old problem we are addressing. But it was the beginning of this journey. We are excited about where we have come today, but there is far to go. After a few years, as we began this journey, and in those years, 10 years ago, there was no plan to follow. It was this road we were learning, Gary, as we went. I think you can identify. We made many mistakes because there was no plan to follow. And we were going, but we knew we had to act. And as you go and as you act, in the face of this evil, friends come alongside, and I believe God helps us. We began to dialogue in 2003 then with several other faith-based organizations whom we discovered also shared our similar passions. We met Lisa Thompson and Salvation Army World Service Office and their staff, World Hope, World Relief, and other organizations who also, unbeknownst to us, coming from different directions with different areas of expertise, had stumbled into this same horrific issue. We were all doing different things, but there were things that brought us together. One of those was the realization that for all of our efforts, if we did not train caregivers, after all the extensive work to identify victims and get them out, if we do not have trained caregivers, we have not finished the job. We have only begun. So our concern was, what do we do about this? So it was 2 years ago now. I remember I got a phone call from a colleague who said, Beth Fast wants to talk to you about heading up a project. So I had already prepared with my husband. I said, honey, my plate is full. Here are the reasons I cannot accept anything else. And then I started to listen on the phone as my colleagues began to say, Beth, we need to do this. Would you head a project to develop an international curriculum to train caregivers to care for those who survive trafficking? As I began to listen and think, the more I listened, in spite of myself, the more excited I got. I thought, how can we not do this? You see, I can say personally, I have been blessed. I have had a blessed life. I have grown up in America. I have had a supportive family. I have had a wonderful husband. I have wonderful colleagues. Our mission has been blessed all along the way. And what hit me in that moment is, Beth, you have been blessed for a reason. This is not about Project Rescue. This is not about fast. This is not about any one organization. It's about the kingdom of God in our world and bringing hope and healing to those who most need it. For that reason, I thought, yes, let's go for it. 20 months ago, we began to develop a curriculum, which I will now lay a copy of down here, so that those of you who might like to look at it after it is available, but can take a look at this. The approach of the curriculum is this. It's called Hands That Heal. Number one, sexual exploitation devastates the whole person. I think what strikes me when I look into the eyes of victims in Calcutta or Mumbai or wherever I meet them is the death in their eyes. You see, sexual slavery is not just a physical slavery. It devastates the whole person. God has created us, body, mind, and spirit. We are multidimensional. And you see, slavery, this kind of trauma, year after year after year, devastates not just the body, but it devastates the whole person. It's as if something has died. When a little girl has been traumatized and raped 20, 25 times a day from the time she is 7, 8, and 9 years of age, something had to die to survive. So you see, care that will be healing and transformational has to be holistic. It has to address the needs of the whole person, psychologically, spiritually, socially, as well as physically. We can use good legal, political, and social means to physically rescue a girl from the enslavement in a brothel, and we are doing that, and you heard about this morning. But we believe as a faith-based organization that only God can take the brothel out of the girl's heart and mind and spirit and change the way she sees herself so that she realizes she was created for a purpose, and that is not it. Hands That Heal curriculum is a Christian response to the recognized need among us that we needed training on 2 levels. We needed training, an academic track that could be dropped into seminaries, colleges, and universities around the world to prepare future leaders, pastors, teachers, and social workers in many cultures to be aware of this issue and this horror, and to be aware of what the needs of survivors are. Friends, this is huge because it takes breaking ground culturally in the minds of future leaders around the world for them to recognize this is an issue we need to engage, because often there's such a stigma associated with it that leaders, even in the church around the world, do not feel we need to go near it. So we must break that kind of ground. The academic track is for that purpose. Secondly, there's a community-based edition designed for informal community settings that could be taught over a period of months, making people in the community aware of the issue of trafficking, informing them that it's multifaceted, and showing them how they can begin to give care that will be life-changing and provide a future. Even this week, the first training of trainers with the curriculum has been occurring in Africa, and there will be 6 on different continents to train trainers from many cultures, from many organizations to begin to give this kind of care. What's the significance of this curriculum? First, it represents a comprehensive intercultural approach to caregiving. We pray that this will become a tool that can be used by our networks and partners, governmental, NGOs, faith-based around the world. The curriculum is also based in the belief that there is a hope and healing in the person and message of Jesus Christ. That is inherent to our hope this morning. And that is a message that is as relevant in the brothel in Bombay as it is in the boardroom in Washington, D.C. Lastly, this represents an unprecedented level of collaboration among over 40 writer contributors to the curriculum, many organizations they represent, and wonderful, generous people like Dr. Ravi Zacharias, who have given so that this could become a reality. A few months ago, my husband was sharing how the Russian mafia, the Albanian mafia, he was moving around the world, how organized crime is organized and networking to perpetuate this evil. And as he spoke that day, something hit me like a fist in my stomach. I thought, dear God, if organized crime can collaborate for the purposes of evil and destruction and greed and exploitation, why cannot people of faith collaborate across boundaries and organizations and denominations and natural boundaries for the purposes of healing and faith and restoration? Do we get it? Organized crime is way ahead of us in that area. This evil is bigger than any one of our organizations, any one of our governments. It will require an unprecedented level of collaboration and partnership if we are going to make a difference. May God help us to commit to that individually and collectively. In closing, the curriculum concludes with a prayer with which I close my remarks this morning. Would you join us in faith? Father, the horror of this darkness overwhelms us. Take fear away and teach us how to fight. Awaken ears to silent cries of victims whose eyes speak death, and yet they somehow live. Fill us with faith that conquers with compassion, with acts of courage celebrating truth. Anoint us by your Spirit for the battle. Free slaves and turn their horror into hope. In the name of the one who took captivity captive. Amen.
Wow. Thank you, Beth. Our next speaker has heard that call well. He considers himself a modern-day abolitionist, and early on was inspired by William Wilberforce and the rest, and has heard stories, as we have heard today, that equally probed his heart. And although he had no 501c3 of his own or government partnerships, because he was in the 7th grade, he still stood by to think, what can I do? So as a 7th grader, he started his own campaign, Loose Change to Loosen Chains. I taught 7th grade for 3 years, and I find that no less than amazing that he was able to do that. Congratulations on many fronts and to your teachers and parents. He is with us today as a 15-year-old who has not only stopped there, but he also speaks across the country to increase public awareness, especially in the next generation. His second book is getting ready to come out. 2 books called Be the Change and Generation Change. I have set it my 10-year goal to equal him coming up soon. So we are very honored to be able to end with the next generation looking forward. Zach Hunter.
All right, thank you everyone for being here today. I'm a little bit nervous to be going after all of you. Thank you, Mr. Hine, for inviting me today, and Ambassador Legan for your commitment to keep the issue of trafficking a priority. I normally don't write out a speech, but I wanted to remember everything I had to say to all of you today, so I wrote this out. I'm Zach Hunter. I'm an abolitionist. I'm also a sophomore in high school outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Just in case you wondered if I had noticed, I know I'm only 15, and I know that I'm not all that. And some of the things I have to say may seem naive. Because I'm only 15, I'm hoping that you'll let me be naive for a little while longer. Many of my heroes are dead people, and these are people that I feel I have a friendship with, and people that I've learned a lot from, people like Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and all those other people, who who made a difference and who fought injustice in their time. I've also learned a lot from William Wilberforce and his friends in Clapham, that when it comes to doing good, everyone has a seat at the table. And the Clapham sect wasn't just made up of policymakers and lawyers, but also poets and artists, teachers and business people, and many others who just had a passion for justice. I'm hoping that in the fight today, there's still room at the table for all of us, including a 15-year-old kid like me. When I was 12, I was studying the history of oppression in America, and I was angered at the injustice. I was reading the diary of Frederick Douglass, and I had wished I could have worked alongside of him and all the other abolitionists. It was then that I learned about human trafficking and discovered that there was still work to be done. And I knew that it wasn't enough to just be angry, because I was angered by this oppression that was going on. I knew that it wasn't enough to be angry, because by my inaction I would have been condoning slavery. So I needed to do something. It was then that I launched Loose Chains to Loosen Chains, which was a student-led campaign to raise awareness and funds for abolitionist organizations, like a lot of them that are supported here. Over the past year and a half, I've spoken to more than 500,000 people. Many of them are students. I've told them what I've learned, and I've told them about many of you who are working to bring slaves freedom around the world. I've told them that I believe God wants to use my generation to do great things and to improve the world. I've told them something that Gary Haugen has taught me, that God has a plan to end the suffering and injustice in the world, and his plan is us. Many people think my generation is self-centered, distracted, and materialistic, and that may be true, but let me tell you what I've seen. My generation knows that the world is a very small place, and thanks to the media, we've seen the suffering up close. Many of us feel responsible to do something about all this suffering. As I speak to students about modern-day slavery, they're outraged, and their reactions, range from how can this be going on in a free world to how can our parents and our government allow this? This petition that I brought with me represents the voice of my generation. We have more than 100,000 signatures of students and leaders saying that they want to see slavery end. I'm just going to unroll this here, sort of a Wilberforcian moment. It's kind of big. But there are more than 100,000 signatures on here. And me and my friends in Georgia assembled more than half of this. So if you see some of the cutting and pasting is a little bit erratic, that's because it was done by 15-year-olds. But through the Amazing Change campaign, which is where this petition to end modern-day slavery originated, through the Amazing Change campaign, students around the world have been gathering the names of people who believe everyone deserves a chance to be free. This year, I'm going to focus a lot more on teaching students about their buying power, asking them to exert their influence with companies that they purchase from, because we are the target market for most of the companies that are out there. Which is kind of interesting when you think that a lot of the products that are mostly used by adults are marketed to teenagers. And a lot of the TV shows are written to a 7th grader's intelligence level, which explains a lot. As we look at the issue of raising awareness, I believe it's key to target my peers. Experts have told me that while it might be the job of your generation to make abolition a priority today, it will probably be my generation that actually ends up abolishing slavery. That's one of the reasons why I've spent so much time trying to educate and mobilize my generation to become abolitionists. I want it to be part of our DNA as the chairs that you vacate today begin to be filled by us. I want my generation to be written about in the history books as a generation that served the poor and the oppressed. So please give us a good foundation and some forward momentum to step into. It would be a terrible crime if in 10 years from now we were still having the same discussions and nothing had really been done about this issue. Our neighbors suffering in the world deserve better than that. And I'm about to say something that may be misjudged by many people, but when I speak of peace here, I'm not talking about the present war. What I'd like to see, the generation of the 60s try to bring about a peace and love generation, and they never really got around to it. What I'd like to see is a new peace and love generation, except maybe a peace, love, and justice generation. And instead of like the generation of the 60s tried to do it without God, I'd like to see a peace, love, and justice generation that could be created with God. Thank you all for your dedication to freedom and justice, and for your willingness to work with my generation to see these ideas that we've discussed become a reality for everyone. Thank you.
Are you kidding me? 15 years old with that wisdom and that heart, and I have to follow it? I'm not going to, actually. I'm just going to take us to the next place of the program with a sincere word of appreciation, not only for your words, but your example, because you have not only inspired us, you've given us a model to follow, because you are one person in action with a remarkable sphere of influence, because you use what you got. And that's a good word for us each to take. So thank you all. I made good on my promise. I said you'd be inspired, and if you weren't listening. And to give you a picture that we are in action, in partnership. And the problem is bigger than us. But I said I like our chances, and they seem to be better after hearing the presentations we heard today. So to each of the speakers, thank you so much for your example, your leadership, your vision, your passion, and your commitment to doing more tomorrow. So now what we're going to do is take a short break. 7 minutes is what I was told, and so that means brief. We do have restrooms for you to use. For the women, it's out your right, so my left, but your right, and for the men, it would be your left, the restrooms. What I'd like to do also is ask Gary Haugen and Ambassador Lagan to join me at the podium during the break if you want to come up and ask them a couple of questions and interact with them. We didn't have time for questions and answers. I apologize for that, but if they'd be gracious enough to do that during our break, you'd have a chance to at least interact with them a little bit. And then we need you back after the break, those of you who can stay, because we are going to see a very important preview of a documentary on the life of William Wilberforce. And following it, we'll have a delightful reception in the Indian Treaty Room, which I will tell you now is an ornate, wonderful former library for the Navy, as Brent described this building's history. However, no Indian treaty was ever signed there to anyone's knowledge. So nonetheless, it's a remarkable room. We'll have good food for you, and we hope that you can stay and participate with us in that as well. With that, I will call you into a break and call you back soon and ask our keynote speakers to join me up front. Would you mind stepping up, and that way people can see you? All right, good. Thank you very much. I'll let folks talk to you.
Karen McLaughlin, I'm the Boston Task Force Against Human Trafficking candidate to the programs. We didn't need to see today. I've already thought
It's a long haul, isn't it? It'll be good to check it this. If it's been,
it's gonna look like we were sitting. We've done a lot of work in one more. We'd love to allow college also, we have networks across the organization and work with us on behalf of patients. So we're very multidisciplinary group around we're not in in one place like you are, international group that has professionals working in the field all over the world, and I love to have follow-up with you.
Thank you. You
But
got my card.
You are really a genuine hero. I can't say enough about your team, the work you're doing in this country, and having been there, I just can't even believe you're able to make any such We'll get this video out to people. It's really good. I use it in a couple of training opportunities.
Thanks for introducing yourself. And please do send me your contact. Thank you. Hi, I'm here. Wonderful. Tell me about you for Human Rights International. Wonderful. Great. Yeah. Yeah.
What is being done to reduce the demand?
Well, I think there's a couple different. Yeah. A couple of things. One is that the demand on the part of the pedophiles and sex tourists is really affected by successful prosecution. And so that's one of the things that just is being increased. And it's really important. At least in the places where we work, in the countries where we work, we find those foreign pedophiles and foreign sex tourists take the evidence then to their home countries, so we're now able to get them deported back home. So we've had many convictions just this past year. And so those actually are not brave people. They go to those countries because they're afraid of getting caught. They think they can get away with it. So as soon as we can really change their calculation of their probability of getting away with it, it will have a big impact. The other thing is the brothel keepers are the ones who create the demand for the trafficking victims. That is to say, it's a secondary market of traffickers who go out, get that product, seize it, and bring it to the brothel keeper. So what we are trying to focus on as well is affecting the demand of the brothel keeper for those victims. Because most of the Johns who come, they don't really care whether it's a forced person or not. There's a small group that do want grotesquely someone to force, but the others just are there to buy sex. They don't care whether it's forced or not. And so that brothel keeper is supplying that labor force with force because it's just cheaper for him. But if he starts going to jail for it, he starts saying to the traffickers, no, don't bring that girl here. The guy next door went to jail for doing that. And so the brothel keeper is really a sitting duck. And if the customers can find the victims of sex trafficking, the police can at any time. And so that's what we have been doing to make sure the brothel keepers go to jail for stimulating that market. So I think it needs to be worked at both angles.
Can the media help out in exposing those that are traveling abroad?
Oh, absolutely. All right. All right. No.
That just send the person underground to go well.
No, it would profound because it's a business that is having to outreach to customers. So there's always going to be a hard level of crime that's underground. It's going to be difficult, but the vast majority of it is open, notorious, and media exposing that and shaming it is really helpful. Where are you located, by the way?
I'm here in Washington.
I love that. Really good.
And the international offices for Human Rights International Services. And what our president has been doing, she's been traveling around to different countries every summer. She goes to between 15 and 30 countries, meeting with officials, meeting with grassroots organizations, again, just using the Declaration of Human Rights as a tool in that way.
Wonderful. Well, I hope you'll send some information our way, and so we can reconnect. I do, yeah. There you go. And tell me your name again?
Susan Taylor.
Susan Taylor. Nice to meet you.
Ask Jay to make available all of your contact information.
That's a good idea. I would hope there is such a list. I'll try to follow up with that.
Yeah, that'd be great, because we need to network.
Indeed. Nice to meet you. Thanks very much. I'm going to say
Mary?
Yes.
Tony Nassif.
Hi, Tony.
We do the conferences, the Preventing Abuse conferences around the country.
Oh, wonderful.
We've got one coming up in LA.
Oh, wonderful.
Our organization is simply educational.
Yes.
We educate John Q. public that you've got the problem.
Yeah.
You're a victim.
Yeah.
Then we motivate them to do something, God's mandate.
Right.
We got chapter and verse.
Right.
Then we activate them to go do something, and then they say, okay, who do I do it with? Then we point to people.
We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. If you want to find your favorite seat.
I look forward to hearing more about it.
So I said yes, that's great.
God said, I'm going to set your face all day. The church is the only one. I'll give you details. You already know. I'll give you something.
I wanted to say
Deborah, how are you? How'd the Save kids.
With apologies. If I could ask you to take your chairs, I'm so sorry to break this up, but we need to. Okay, we'll be beginning the documentary in just one moment. If I could ask Kenneth Morris to stand. Is he in the room? Kenneth, if you could stand for one moment. Kenneth is the great-great-great-grandson of a hero that Zach inspired us his memory about just a moment ago, Frederick Douglass. And so we have another special member in our company, and the Frederick Douglass Family Foundation is committed to this cause. So indeed, we're graced by your presence. Thank you. Chuck Stetson, if you could join me on stage. Mr. Stetson is a social entrepreneur. He has been successful in venture capital and in the business world, and he's done so with a purpose. He heads something called the Wilberforce Project that he can describe to you, and has been very active in other social ventures that improve society, and indeed resonates with so many of the themes that we heard about today. In many respects, he has called us to a better hour, which is indeed the name of the documentary you're about to see. It's also, Chuck, if I could, the name taken from a sonnet written about the life of Wilberforce, and maybe by way of introduction I could quote that part of the sonnet, which we should reflect upon. We'll hear again, I think, in the documentary, but goes like this. William Wilberforce was creating a better hour for humankind, an hour in which goodness is more fashionable than evil, in which generosity is more fashionable than greed, and in which freedom is more fashionable than slavery. And Chuck, you have led a project that we are now going to enjoy the fruits of. You've done so much more, and it's my privilege to welcome you as friend, and to give you a very public word of appreciation for your leadership and sponsorship of the product we're about to enjoy. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. I really appreciate that, and I'll be brief. And I'm just glad, Zach, that you're here, and Penny. That's great. Zach has been our student spokesperson from the Wilberforce Project, and I just want to make just a couple of bullet point type of comments. Obviously, there's been a lot of references to William Wilberforce, and he was a household name in the 19th century. Abraham Lincoln was able to say in 1858 that, of course, every schoolboy knows William Wilberforce. Today, it's improving. Last year, it was 3% of Americans that could actually say they knew William Wilberforce reasonably well. I got some data from Walden Media that did Amazing Grace, and after the motion picture came out, it's up to 45 million Americans, so 15%. And what I've been going around speaking and saying is that I think we're going to double that in the next year. So I'm really excited about that. I've got to know William Wilberforce because I'm on the Wilberforce Forum Board. As part of Prison Fellowship, there's been a William Wilberforce Award. I remember looking at the program some years ago and saying, "Who is this guy?" Because I'm embarrassed that I didn't know, but he did. He's kind of a personal hero, and he's just done so many amazing things. But the bottom line is that it's a message of great hope, and hope has been one of the comments that has been made here a lot. He was able to take with several of his friends. It was just actually a very small group. The Clapham circle was only about 10 people. But just by working, networking, using their money, just using their resources, they were able to change a self-indulgent and decadent world into what became Victorian England. So it's very exciting. The film that you're about to see, we've been in discussions with public broadcasting. They've made they've made several editorial comments that we're all now squared away with. We expect to have this in February. We'll have some of those details on our website as soon as we have that, but we expect to have that in the next month or so. But one of the reasons we went to PBS is that they have 40,000, it's not well known, they have 40,000 public school teachers that follow PBS. And so it's very important. Plus, the PBS imprimatur is very important. On the one hand, yes, Wilberforce was a Christian, and they were driven, the Clapham Circle was driven by their faith. But on the other hand, the point that we would make, particularly to the schools, is if you want to know anything about where the source for modern-day human rights came from, what the movement that ultimately led to voting for women, universal education for both women and children, the first child labor laws, some huge prison reform that was basically done in England, just changing the whole environment in England and kind of uplifting virtue in England. If you want to know anything about philanthropy, 100 years before Andrew Carnegie wrote his Gospel of Wealth, you'd have to look to William Wilberforce. So it's a great story. We've tried to capture as much of that in the film that we have here. We've had some good feedback from scholars. We showed it in England at David Richardson's event back in May. So we've had some great comments there. We have actually some other resources. We have a book that's be out next Monday on William Wilberforce. It's the only one kind of designed really for the faith community, which has 4 parts. What did Wilberforce and the Clapham Group do at the time? What are some of the issues today? Number 3 is who are some of the Wilberforces today and what are they doing? And then how can you be Wilberforce? Because we've got to take this out to the people. And that's one of the things that I haven't really seen much of. And so I hope with the DVD, with the book, and some of the other things, we'll be able to do that. It's a message of great hope. I'm going to caution you at the beginning that there are some wonderful prints. They're very graphic. They're also pretty hard to watch. So I'm going to just give you that particular caution. But thank you very much. Let's see the film.
Men and women on both sides of the Atlantic knew that the horrible, degrading, and hateful business of slavery had to come to an end. The abolition movement grew daily in strength of numbers and was made up of men and women of goodwill, of freed slaves, reformed slave traders, clergymen of many faiths, and former slaves. They had all set for themselves the task of ridding the world of this crime against humanity. But how would they focus their energies? Who would carry their cause to the seat of government? One man came to see this work as his destiny. That man was William Wilberforce. This is his story. This is his legacy. Any form of slavery is always deplorable, but the conditions of the legal and lucrative transatlantic slave trade itself were infinitely worse. The slave ships would leave from Bristol or London or Liverpool, taking their cargoes, largely of manufactured goods, to West Africa. Once there, the ships would exchange the goods for slaves. Some of the slaves were prisoners of tribal wars or condemned criminals. But the vast majority were ordinary, innocent people who were torn from home and family. They were kidnapped, branded, flogged into a state of numbed submission. Then they were loaded onto canoes that would take them out to a ship. Once there, they were crammed into the hold, where they were kept in chains, each of them confined to a space smaller than a coffin. Thomas Clarkson, one of the leading British abolitionists, drew a diagram showing how 450 slaves were transported on what was known as the Middle Passage, the journey from Africa to the West Indies. On an earlier voyage, the slave ship, the Brooks, had carried 609. Occasionally, the slaves were taken up on deck for exercise, but most of the time was spent in appalling heat, suffering agonies of dysentery and seasickness, lying in an atmosphere so fetid that it gutted the few candles lit to curb the stench. A slave ship could be smelled across a mile of ocean. Many died in agony. Many others were driven insane. In such cases, they were thrown overboard. The journey took at least 100 days, and if the weather was bad, the journey could last a lot longer.
Slavery is not just a degrading relationship in itself. It degrades the mind and the heart of the slave. The slave suffers from fear, from a complete lack of what we would now, I suppose, call self-worth. The slave is subjected to utterly unjustifiable, unreasonable terrors in the whole process of captivity.
If you take the word slavery away from this whole story, what was it really about? It was about the wicked traffic in human beings. It was about the destruction of a civilization and culture in Africa and in the Caribbean. It was about lust. It was about greed, the huge greed that people had, not just white people, but also some Africans who were selling their own people for money.
The evidence that was given to Parliament about the reality of the slave ships, the brutality, the violence, the death, the sexual, predatory nature towards African women, all of that makes a profound impact on the British people. And it becomes clear that there's a huge amount of money to be made from the slave trade. But the question then arises, how can you justify making money at such a kind of human cost? How can you justify the fact that the British want their sugar grown by slaves to sweeten their tea? How can you justify that in terms of the violence that's done to Africans? And not just to a few Africans. We're talking about the largest movement of people, enforced movement of people until the Second World War. This is a huge, huge operation. And it becomes clear that it's based on violence and brutality of an extraordinary scale.
Perhaps the most vivid instance of abuses associated with the slave trade was the atrocities that took place aboard the slave ship Zong, where 132 slaves were cast overboard when there was a water shortage, thinking that rather than lose the slaves to death and perhaps incur some type of financial loss, if they were tossed overboard, then an insurance claim could be advanced for a property loss. This was an outrageous, horrific thing. I mean, it staggers the imagination that anyone could have ever allowed something so horrific to take place. When the case was brought to trial, because there were people who were outraged and wanted to see justice done, the presiding judge in the case said it was as if horses had been thrown overboard. And I don't think anything can drive home the sense of inhumanity, the coarseness of the culture of that day, than that kind of decision.
Even when the slaves arrived at their destination, their sufferings were by no means over. Having spent 3 months of semi-starvation, they were kept on the ship a few more days to be fattened up by force feeding before being driven naked through the streets to the auction block. Those that were still too sick or too weak were unloaded, dumped in the dock, and left there to die. A century and a half ago, Abraham Lincoln claimed that every schoolboy in America was familiar with the man and his story. Today, on both sides of the Atlantic, even his name is largely forgotten. And yet, the story of William Wilberforce contains a paradigm of how a person's character, the integration of faith, knowledge, principle, friendship, passion, and action can become a force to change the world for the better.
Summarizing Wilberforce's legacy is always difficult because it's so multifaceted. It extends far beyond the abolition of the slave trade and slavery. Wilberforce, in many ways, his work anticipates the work of people like Martin Luther King Jr., people of faith seeking social justice. The other notion is that wherever you are, in whatever walk of life you are, you have a purpose, you have a role to play. I think of what Archbishop Desmond Tutu said. Wilberforce shows us that everyone can make a difference. Few of us will be in Parliament as Wilberforce was, but all of us are part of community. All of us can find ways to serve others and bring about the good society.
Wilberforce is remembered as the man at the heart of abolition and has been memorialised any number of ways, whether it's in the formation of a university or in statues all over Britain. He was at the centre of it all, but it's also because the way the history of abolition evolved. And is it possible, is it feasible to imagine that without Wilberforce, the slave trade would have ended as and when it did? Well, the answer to that is no.
He said right from the beginning that he wanted to see the end of slavery. I don't think he was a man who set out with a clear plan. He just did what he felt he must do, and he realized from the start that nothing would happen unless Parliament passed an act. But you must remember, at the same time, he was very, very conscious of the need to transform what he would have called the manners of England, we would call the morals of England.
Wilberforce welded together the ideals of justice for all, racial equality, concern for the poor in this country, welded all that together with a straightforward and simple faith.
But in reality, he probably was ahead of his time, because I think the environmentalists, certainly the abolitionists, those who voice various kinds of needs for freedom in certain areas, women, in almost every category, he probably represents the model for all of it. Though he has not been ascribed such, we can still look at William Wilberforce, not just as a symbol, but as a human being who made a contribution, because we know where his heart was.
William Wilberforce was born in Hull in 1759. His birthplace still stands. It looks like a prosperous merchant's house, exactly what it was. For over a century, his family had been very successful, made wealthy by the Baltic trade. His grandfather had 2 terms as the city's mayor. With his wealth, charm, and social position, young William could have enjoyed an easy life of privilege. True, he was small, little over 5 feet, delicate and nearsighted. But Wilberforce had great ambition and the gifts of intellect and personal magnetism that overcame his physical limitations. He stood for Parliament, and in 1780, within days of his 21st birthday, he became the Member of Parliament for Hull. 3 years later, he was elected to the more prestigious constituency, the County of Yorkshire. By this time, he had already gained what was to become the most important friendship of his life, that of William Pitt. Pitt, who was just 3 months older than Wilberforce, was a phenomenon. He was to become Prime Minister at the age of 24, by far the youngest premier in British history. He was also considered to have the finest intellect of his generation. He was a classical scholar, a brilliant mathematician, and an orator of awesome skill. Unfortunately, he did not get on quite as well with people. He once confessed to Wilberforce that he thought himself to be the shyest man alive. His shyness often made him seem cold, even arrogant. Many people found it far easier to admire Pitt than to have any real affection for him. Wilberforce, however, loved Pitt and considered him the wittiest man alive.
Wilberforce and Pitt met as undergraduates at Cambridge. Pitt was a far more serious student than Wilberforce. We might refer to Wilberforce as something of a party boy today.
He would stay up till 4 and 5 and 6 a.m. They were famous for singing to the wee hours of the morning. That was the world that he thrived in, and that's the world that he entered when he entered Cambridge. He was known for being insouciant. Insouciant was the best adjective you could have as a student in those days.
He did study a little. He had a natural interest in poetry and the classics, but for the most part, he would host people in his room. There was always a Yorkshire pie. It was said in his rooms. He knew how to entertain. So they were not drawn together by virtue of their studies. But it was when they came to the end of their time at Cambridge that Pitt and Wilberforce both, especially Pitt, who had been groomed for politics since boyhood, began to think about politics. Wilberforce by this time had become friendly with Pitt. They had a circle of young friends, most of whom were going to enter politics if they could. And Wilberforce, this merchant's son who had made his way in polite and affluent society, thought, I'd like to go on with these friends. I'd like to continue with them in Parliament. And so Wilberforce and Pitt began to attend debates in the House of Commons. All the great speakers were there, and they began to desire a place in their company.
When he did decide to enter into the larger fray, he began to show how utterly devastating he could be as a debater. William Pitt knew that his greatest ally in the House of Commons was his friend, William Wilberforce. Wilberforce was the ultimate weapon. He was as witty, as sarcastic, as brilliant an orator as anyone had ever seen. When he decided to go against someone, they were frightened that he would really embarrass them. There was no one who was really his equal in terms of parliamentary debate.
We make a great mistake if we think that Wilberforce was free of faults. He himself knew that he had a quick temper. His family members, he said, were often grieved by flashes of his quick temper. One gets the impression that he got used to the wealth, he got used to being deferred to, he got used to sort of having his way with less gifted politicians in the House of Commons. He didn't suffer fools gladly, I guess would be the way to put it, prior to his great change.
If William Wilberforce had simply pursued an ordinary parliamentary career, he would no doubt have been a well-regarded historical figure. But his life and career took an extremely serious turn. When Wilberforce was 25, his friends began to notice a gradual change in his character, and indeed on his whole outlook on life. The change seems to have started with a renewed friendship with Isaac Milner, his old schoolmaster. He and Milner went together on a tour through France and Italy in 1785, during which the seeds were sown in Wilberforce for a personal and a wholehearted embrace of Christianity.
What happened on the journey was not something Wilberforce or even Milner could have ever anticipated. Isaac Milner was one of the most brilliant minds of his day. He occupied the Lucasian chair at Cambridge, and he was really someone that Wilberforce thought would make a great conversationalist for this long trip. But Wilberforce noticed that when the subject of religion came up, Milner was strangely serious. It was the only subject on which Milner seemed to be serious. Wilberforce, of course, subscribed to the fashionable Unitarian Enlightenment rationalist views of his day and didn't take traditional Christianity very seriously at all. So he mocked Milner's thinking. And at one point, Milner said something to him along the lines of, you know, Wilberforce, I'm no match for you in this running fire, as he called it. But if you actually want to have a conversation on this, let me know, and I would be glad to do it. At some point on their journey, Wilberforce noticed a book by a man named Philip Doddridge. The book was called The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul. He asked Milner, what do you think of that book? Milner said, it's one of the best books ever written. Why don't we take it with us and discuss it? So they did. What follows changed Wilberforce's life and all of history.
By the time Wilberforce returned to England in the autumn of 1785, he was in a full-blown spiritual crisis. And he began to think, who can I seek out? Who could be a mentor for me? Who could help me sort through these things beyond Milner, who had to return to Cambridge? And the only person he could think of was John Newton, this man whom he'd known as a boy, whom he'd not seen in about 15 years.
John Newton was the son of an officer in the Merchant Navy. In his youth, he had sailed on a ship to West Africa, where he had hoped to be overseer of a slave depot off the coast. But he soon found himself shanghaied as one of the slaves.
Well, Newton really reached the lowest point ever. He fell ill when he was on an island in Sierra Leone, and he nearly died there and was very badly treated. That's the point that I think he begins to call himself a wretch. And I'm sure that's where Amazing Grace that saved a wretch like me comes.
He was not what you call a choir boy. He had become a slave trader. We would think of him today as someone guilty of crimes against humanity. When he had been rescued several times from trouble, elements of desertion, his father had interceded for him.
He had to crawl out to eat raw roots at night. The slaves in chains saved up scraps of food that they could scarcely spare for him. So he refers to himself, and on his epitaph, which he wrote, servant of slaves in Africa.
Someone who had himself been a slave trader, was rescued from that whole setting and brought back to England. And within a matter of time, he was actually given command of a ship. He became a slave ship captain. It was certainly much better than what had gone before in terms of his personal fate, but he still hadn't shaken himself free of this great evil, this national institution called slavery. He went on several slave trading missions. Finally, for reasons of health, these imprisonment, this enslavement he'd had, broke his health, and he had to leave the sea. And it was then that he'd been going through a very gradual spiritual transformation that culminated ultimately in the most unlikely scenario. This former slave trader became a parson, became a rector, he became a clergyman. He also became a hymn writer.
After Newton fully embraced Christianity, he published his story. The book, entitled An Authentic Narrative, became a bestseller in Britain and America. In 1764, Newton was ordained a priest in the Church of England. He was made the rector at Saints Peter and Paul in Olney, and later at St. Mary's in Woolner.
Wilberforce thought, if there's one person I might dare to speak with about my troubles, it would be John Newton. He sent a letter to Newton asking, can I meet with you? But you must tell no one. Tell no one that I'm coming.
And then the secret meeting was arranged for Wednesday, 6th of December in Newton's home in Charles Square. And Wilberforce got there, and he just could not pluck up the courage to knock on Newton's door. And he walked around the square at least a couple of times before he could bring himself to do it.
Wilberforce said after that interview, when I came away, my mind was in a calm and tranquil state. And what is more, Newton gave Wilberforce incredibly unconventional advice. Most evangelical Christians saw the world as a worldly, dirty place to be shunned, a place filled with sin. Newton thought and said to Wilberforce, stay in Parliament, keep up your friendship with Pitt. It may be that for such a time as this, invoking the Old Testament language of Esther, that God may have a purpose for you in politics. Well, Newton not only proved wise, he proved prophetic.
And what a moment for Newton also. He was overwhelmed to see history in the making, because he could see what could happen through this young man.
As Newton standing beside Wilberforce saying, join your life up. You know, you have a crisis, of course you have a crisis, but it's a crisis of disintegration, not of integration. What God wants for him is his wholeness and his healing, and bringing together and joining together things that in his own life before he became a Christian, were pretty much torn apart. There is not a part of his life that is not outside the influence and the sphere of God. And when he came to that point, when he was settled at that point, the whole of his life came together.
Wilberforce knew that he had to discover God's purpose for his life. And the change that matters, I think, in his life, as in everybody's life, is the point where you begin to ask, what's the purpose, what's the call? And that doesn't mean that a voice from the sky will tell you the answer, or that you can open the Bible and just read it off straight away. It means that you begin to say, what is it that only I can do? And of course Wilberforce, very interestingly, very movingly, is involved in discerning just that question. Is there something that I can do with my gifts, my influence, my wealth, my connections? Something I can do? Well, yes, there is. I have leverage that other people don't in this particular task. And it may be that I've been given all these things so that I use them for this.
Wilberforce was very worried about how his conversion would affect his friendship with Pitt. Pitt assured Wilberforce that nothing could affect their friendship. Pitt was more worried that Wilberforce might retire from politics. In point of fact, Wilberforce was thinking about seeking ordination as a clergyman. Newton's advice and Pitt's wishes won the day. Wilberforce wrote,
My walk is a public one. My business is in the world, and I must mix in the assemblies of men, or quit the post which Providence seems to have assigned me.
On Sunday, October 27, 1787, Wilberforce finally made up his mind. After church services and another long conversation with Newton, he wrote the 4 simple lines that have become one of the greatest personal mission statements of all time.
God Almighty has placed before me 2 great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners.
Those 2 objectives were to drive William Wilberforce, guiding him, fueling him, and focusing all his energies for the rest of his days.
It became clear he was going to have a long and tedious and taxing fight on his hands. It took 20 years. And Wilberforce suffered perhaps the greatest setbacks, the greatest personal crises he'd ever known during that 20-year fight. If one thinks of the 1790s as perhaps the most dire and taxing period of Wilberforce's life, that picture is helpful.
Even William Wilberforce might have given up in despair had it not been for the support and the affection of his friends, and above all, that special group of friends known as the Clapham Circle.
In Clapham, there is a magnificent building called Holy Trinity Church. Built in 1776, it was really the spiritual center for the Clapham Circle, and its pastor, John Venn, was in many respects for the Clapham Circle what Newton was for Wilberforce personally.
And so you've got John Venn nurturing and caring for and about not just the Clapham sect, not just the 12 or so who were worshipping here. This church was full. This had 1,200 people this church seats. And every Sunday there was a notice up that said church full. You know, you can't get any more people. You can't shoehorn anybody else into this building for its main act of worship.
But this is the place where the Clapham Circle found their sense of mission, where they began to understand how faith can have a good effect in the public square. If we think of Holy Trinity Clapham as sort of a spiritual center, where they got the underpinnings, the the sense of principles, the sense of faith in forming their labors in the public square. One cannot lay enough stress on how important Holy Trinity was. You had James Stephen, who was a lawyer, Henry Thornton, a political economist, Hannah More, the gifted playwright and poet who lent her pen to the cause. Probably a group of about 10 people all told, but no prime minister ever had a more gifted set of colleagues, a more dedicated set of colleagues. And they were profoundly important to Wilberforce. They provided him with advice, with counsel. They helped him to recharge his batteries through the gift of fellowship. They were a very powerful network of friends and politicians and reformers. There's really been nothing like them. But it wasn't as though Wilberforce said, I'm going to gather to myself this group of talented friends. It grew up very subtly over time.
But a small group of friends around him, Quakers, evangelicals from the Church of England, and what they were really surprised about was just how widespread feeling was. Once they began to campaign in the country, travel the country, talk to people, try to agitate locally, they found that there were huge numbers of people willing to join the campaign against the slave trade. They did this by attending lectures in huge numbers, but particularly by signing petitions. All joined in to say that there's something wrong with the slave trade and it must be ended.
I think when you look at William Wilberforce and most people who accomplish, it's never by yourself. Though you might be the point person, you might get the credit. But really what brings that about is, I think, basically 3 principles. 1, giving people a vision of what can be, establishing values on which those visions become reality, and then empowering other people. If William Wilberforce had not freed anybody else, then he would not be someone that we would be talking about here now.
But his great gift was a gift for networking, a gift of connecting people, helping them to find common cause. And so when he and the Clapham Circle took something on board, the ripple effect throughout British society was really very effective.
The struggle for full abolition of the slave trade took 20 years, and the fight for complete emancipation of all slaves took another 26 years. During that long fight, Wilberforce never lost sight of the second of his great objectives, the reformation of manners. The word manners, what did it mean? In the language of the 19th century, the word conveyed the moral fiber of the nation.
Wilberforce is the person who shines like a star at a time when Britain was pretty dissolute, pretty shambolic in terms of its public morality, who said, hold on, let's campaign for the big issues, but let's do that as Christians. But let's also make sure that that big public campaign is sustained by our own internal private life. That's the fuel, if you like, that fires the engine of campaigning.
Wilberforce realized 2 essential facts: that to abolish the slave trade and eventually slavery, he had to win over the members of Parliament, but to reform the morals of the country, he had to win over the people who were most important in guiding the attitudes of the age. And whereas today it might be pop stars and football stars, in Wilberforce's day it was the great nobles, the great landowners, and he set out to make goodness fashionable, and he succeeded.
And when Wilberforce was referring to the reformation of manners, he was really talking about the work of cultural renewal. One must always remember that the time in which Wilberforce lived was a very coarse time in terms of the cultural barometer. Dueling, adultery, gambling, the ravages of cheap gin, the bad conditions in factories, the grievous conditions in factories, child labor. It was a time where inhumanity, incivility, dire social conditions were rife. So when Wilberforce began to talk about the work of moral reform, the work of cultural renewal, These were the kinds of things, these social ills that he was taking aim at. The idea was to strengthen the nation's moral consensus.
There's no question that Wilberforce's faith animated his battle to end the slave trade and to bring about the end of slavery itself. But what it also did was it gave him a view of humanity that was completely different than what had existed up to that point in cultures and societies and in politics. And this new view of humanity, which arose from his faith, said that anywhere you see suffering and injustice, you are obliged to deal with it. You're obliged to fight against it.
Wilberforce was involved in the founding, leading, or financially supporting of over 60 organizations that worked for the betterment of society. The work of these organizations included addressing the abuses of child labor, education for the deaf, prison reform, the National Gallery of Art, smallpox inoculation, and schools for indigent children. It was his firm belief that these organizations would bring about what the poet William Cooper called the better hour for all in society. Wilberforce's personal generosity led him to commit his personal time and his fortune to provide a voice for people who had no voice. By the end of his life, his considerable fortune was gone, because he did not only give from his excess, but from his very substance. Many of the societies and charitable organizations formed by Wilberforce and his friends still exist today. Their continued existence is part of one of the greatest philanthropic legacies in the Western world. William Wilberforce had accepted his mission, and he was now fully armed for the struggle ahead. The first thing that he and his fellow abolitionists had to decide was what they must abolish. Remember that there were two distinct evils: the institution of slavery itself, and the other, the slave trade. The abolitionists knew that they could not fight both battles at once. They knew, too, that ridding the world of the institution of slavery and granting freedom and status to all the enslaved would challenge the current notion of private property. Yet one simple act of Parliament could abolish the slave trade. So the abolitionists decided to concentrate first on stopping the trade.
The slave trade, when Wilberforce began to think about seeking its abolition, was an incredibly large part of the British economy. The analogy's been given that it was as much a part of the British economy, the economy of the empire, as the American defense industry is today. It was a significant part of their gross national product. It was firmly entrenched. Many members of Parliament owed their family fortunes, their place in Parliament, to the wealth, the power, the prestige derived from the slave trade. So the notion of Wilberforce taking that on, it was an incredibly daunting task.
Wilberforce's initial strategy was to secure abolition by international convention. He was worried that British traders would not agree to abolition if they thought other nations would simply gobble up their share of the market. His hopes for an international convention were dashed. So early in 1788, Wilberforce, with the help of the abolitionists, began preparing the case and gathering public support. The strain of preparing such a massive case led to exhaustion, fever, and a breakdown in Wilberforce's physical and mental health. Many thought he was dying. That little fellow, his doctors declared, has not the stamina to last a fortnight.
It's recorded for us. The guy was given to kind of bouts of depression, and he got down about life, he got despondent and despairing. Did Wilberforce know at the beginning of his campaign for the abolition of the slave trade that it would take him 20 years? And, I'm sure if he thought about that, he'd think, I have no influence.
Yet in May, he stood up in the House of Commons and spoke for 3.5 hours. The three greatest parliamentarians of the day, William Pitt, Edmund Burke, and Charles James Fox, all supported him. Yet, the West Indian planters had a powerful lobby of their own and insisted on postponing the vote until even more evidence had been heard. In April 1791, Wilberforce once again moved for abolition. He quoted one of the witnesses in the inquiry, a Captain Knox, who had testified that on the Middle Passage, the slaves slept during the night in very tolerable comfort. Knox admitted, however, that he had carried 290 of them in a vessel of only 120 tons, which meant that there was no room for all of them to have lain on their backs, much less sleep in tolerable comfort.
In 1796, he had the votes lined up, enough to carry the day. His opponents resorted to an insidious tactic. That with hindsight devastated Wilberforce. They gave enough free opera tickets to lure away enough of Wilberforce's lukewarm supporters to an opera. They decided going to the opera was more important than abolishing the slave trade. Wilberforce lost that vote in the House of Commons by 4 votes, and he suffers what appears to have been his second nervous breakdown. Mentally, he was distraught. Physically, his health broke. He considered throwing over politics. He had been in the fight for 9 years trying to end the slave trade. He was devastated. Images of slaves in chains, in bondage, the horrors of the Middle Passage ran through his mind. He couldn't sleep.
So enormous, so dreadful, so irremediable did the trade's wickedness appear that my own mind was completely made up for abolition. Let the consequences be what they would, I from this time determined that I would never rest until I had effected its abolition.
Again and again, Wilberforce brought the abolition bill before Parliament. Again and again, despite growing evidence of the horrors of the trade and the growing will of the people to abolish the trade, the bill was defeated. Wilberforce did not confine his campaign to Parliament. He worked with his circle of friends and with the abolitionists to change public opinion everywhere. The slave rebellions in the Caribbean caught the attention of the plantation owners. The speaking and writing of a former slave, Equiano, raised the consciousness of the nation to this great evil that had been until now largely invisible to the British people. Wilberforce and the abolitionists fostered public discussion on the horrors of slavery at all levels. They sponsored petition drives that demonstrated how the tide of public opinion was turning against slavery. They used a distinctly modern technique, one that is now a part of every political movement and campaign. The abolitionists commissioned Josiah Wedgwood, potter to the king and a friend of Wilberforce, to design a plaque that would provide the visual symbol for the abolition movement. It was a picture of a slave in shackles with the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?"
So the brilliant thing about the abolition movement was it was one of the first, if you like, marketing movements of its time. It actually understood about branding itself. It understood about pulling in different groups of the coalition. They needed William Wilberforce and his influence in Parliament. They invited Thomas Clarkson to join them. These people all helped to feed information into William Wilberforce. And Wilberforce was, through the fact that they went and gathered information about life on the plantations, about what was going on, that fueled Wilberforce's power in Parliament and his ability to make Parliament move.
Still, the motion for abolition was consistently rejected. Wilberforce refused to give up. Year after year, he proposed it in the House of Commons, and year after year, the bill was rejected, for the next 16 years. During that time, there were many threats on his life. On one visit to Yorkshire, a friend insisted on accompanying him as an armed bodyguard. Throughout the entire campaign, he suffered from almost constant ill health and considerable pain, but he never wavered in his determination.
When you think of the number of times the legislation was proposed and rejected, and Wilberforce's enormous courage and persistence in this. I think that really puts in perspective the very shallow, short-term goals that often characterize modern politics. Something's got to be done within this electoral cycle, and if not, well, maybe we need to forget about it.
Wilberforce is a much more complex figure than we might think. He was clearly a very devout man. He sticks by this campaign, the abolition of the slave trade, for 30 years, and then sticks to the campaign against slavery for many years afterwards. It was that sheer kind of dogged steadfastness, in a way, to ending the slave trade that characterizes him above all else.
The date was February 23, 1807. The House of Commons was again set to debate the slave trade abolition bill. This time, however, the sentiment was different. The great public relations campaign had produced results. There was no doubt, thanks to the efforts of the abolitionists and the dogged determination of Wilberforce, that the bill would pass. During the session, there was the most dramatic moment when Attorney General Samuel Romilly rose to his feet. He painted a vivid portrait of Napoleon and Wilberforce retiring for the evening that very day. Napoleon may be going to bed secure in his power, but his sleep would be tormented by the blood he had spilled, the lives he had destroyed. After the historic vote in Parliament, however, Wilberforce would return quietly to the bosom of his family and would sleep in peace and in sheer joy, knowing that he had preserved the lives of millions of his fellow creatures.
Was unlike any other in history. It was electric. Wilberforce went to the House of Commons, and as debate began on the bill abolishing the slave trade, members would jump to their feet in bunches, in groups. They all wanted to speak on this great issue. It became apparent very early on that something very different was going to take place.
Every member of Parliament who was there that day, about 300 of them, were sure that this was the day history would be made. They knew, they had a self-consciousness about being part of history.
This House, conceiving the African slave trade to be contrary to the principles of justice, humanity, and sound policy, will with all practicable expedition proceed to take effectual measures for abolishing the said trade.
And at that moment, the House thought that was a wonderful point, and they started to cheer, and Wilberforce, overcome with emotion, sat there with his head bowed and tears streaming down his face as he thought that this act at long last was going to become law.
When the members of Parliament saw him weeping, they all stood. Everyone in the chamber stood and applauded and cheered, 3 cheers for William Wilberforce. This was completely unprecedented. The cheers, the cheering made Wilberforce weep the more. His weeping made them cheer the more. It was glorious bedlam in the House of Commons. It was one of those moments that is that we can look at as a genuinely historic moment. It changed the course of the world.
After the bill passed, almost overnight, the once vilified Wilberforce became a national hero. His old friend, Sir James Mackintosh, framed the sentiments of the nation.
We are apt perpetually to express our wonder that so much exertion should be necessary to suppress such flagrant injustice. The more just reflection will be that a short period of the short life of one man is, well and wisely directed, sufficient to remedy the miseries of millions for ages.
It was the moment that he'd worked for, that he'd suffered for, that he and his friends had worked countless hours amidst such difficulty. It was a moment that was unlike any other. It has been described as one of the 3 or 4 perfectly virtuous moments in human history. And the vote was overwhelming, 283 to 16. There had been a sea change in British national life. Wilberforce had created a consensus that the slave trade was a great, tragic national sin, and it had to be dealt with.
The abolition of the slave trade was a tremendous achievement, but Wilberforce could not rest until the institution of slavery was eliminated throughout the empire and every slave was free. He again dedicated his life and his energy to the task. The Napoleonic Wars threw all Europe into confusion until 1815, stalling the emancipation efforts. Then, almost immediately after the war's end, Wilberforce suffered personal tragedies. Through all his personal tragedies, he continued to lead the fight for emancipation. In 1825, he realized that he could work no longer. He was at the time 66. His friend Pitt had died at 47, and he himself had for years been a sick man, consistently wearing himself out for the sake of the cause he believed in above all others.
We have a tendency to think of Wilberforce with hindsight as someone who carried everything before him, this great crusader for social justice. I think we need to step back from that a bit and realize that he was a very human person. Not only did he have faults and failings against which he struggled, like his temper, but he also had to contend with these physical ailments. He was constantly subject to them. Whether it was poor eyesight, he eventually lost his hearing. As he grew older, he developed severe curvature of the spine. He was not a robust man. He was someone who suffered a great deal in pursuit of something larger than himself.
After the slave trade was abolished in 1807, it took until 1833 for slavery itself to be ended in the British Empire. On his deathbed, he received word that slavery would be ended. The thing that he had dreamt about his whole life would actually have happened, and that he would have been there to hear of it, and then 3 days later to get his final reward.
Wilberforce died, knowing the work that had consumed him and his fellow abolitionists for almost 50 years had been accomplished. On the day of his burial in Westminster Abbey, a friend wrote to one of Wilberforce's sons, "Today, as I came down the Strand, every third person I met going about their ordinary business was a Negro." So, a week or two later, were the slaves in the West Indies. Their freedom was assured.
And I think the triumph of the abolition movement is that it did end. It did end. And that, I think, is ultimately about the triumph of good over evil. And that, for me, was the part of the story that raised my heart, because I felt that there is something in the human psyche that will make us always rise up against oppression, even when we are the oppressors. I do not think that abolition would have been achieved without people who believed in God. Because I think that the enslaved Africans needed God just for the faith and ability to survive each day. And so I think that the role of Christianity was an incredibly profound part of the abolition movement.
You see it in the life of William Wilberforce, you see it in the life of Martin Luther King Jr., you see it in the life of Gandhi. They made decisions that this can be done in a nonviolent fashion. And if we do it that way, it is not about the bloodshed, but it is about having pricked the conscience of people to make them have to think about the reality that you are enslaving other human beings. And that is not a right that is given to you by God.
William Wilberforce put everything he was and everything he had on the line for his two great objects. He leveraged his social position. He leveraged his political capital. He leveraged his friendships and relationships, his strength and energy, and his personal fortune, literally all he had, to see the slaves set free and to see England arrive at her better hour.
The British historian Trevelyan describes the moment a year after the vote in 1834 when slavery would be ended in the British Empire. And he describes this image of the West Indian Negroes on a hill waiting for the sunrise, knowing that the moment the sun rose, the moment that day dawned, they would be free. It's just an extraordinary image and shows us that real human beings were involved in this. Human beings who hoped for freedom, who awaited the sunrise to celebrate something that they thought could never possibly happen in their lifetimes.
After the abolition of the slave trade, it was said that Wilberforce was the conscience of the nation. Although it was something without precedent, it became something that ennobled the British nation, called them, to use Lincoln's phrase, to remember the better angels of their nature. Wilberforce's power, the power of his personality, the power of his principles, helped change British life, and one cannot lay enough stress upon that.
Abolitionist Frederick Douglass said, "It was the faithful, persistent, and enduring enthusiasm of William Wilberforce and his noble co-workers that finally thawed the British heart into sympathy with his land, and moved the strong arm of that government in mercy to put an end to his bondage. Let no American, especially no colored American, be without a generous recognition of this stupendous achievement. What though it was not American, but British, it was a triumph of right over wrong, of good over evil, and a victory for the whole human race."
Let them be born and free, ring with the harp.
Not to give you the illusion that I am singing, would not even try. We're just going to continue this conversation that has been started this morning and underlined so well here in the Indian Treaty Room for a reception. It is warm and there is food, so it's a win-win. A quick instruction, if I could, before you go, please avail yourself of the extra materials out this side to my left. And there are people there to direct you around the corner. There's a little bit of a maze, but if you follow the crowd, I think you'll be fine. Thank you. You will not be coming back here, so take your friends and belongings.
What's your schedule?
So the reception for a while, then has some standing singers, and there's some to speak to some large student gatherings in Germany and in Scotland. So I guess there's a family there that wants to talk about this.
Should I talk to you?
Yeah, that looks good. I just want to shake your hand.
so proud of you. I went to university, and we've got students who are going to Africa and college for years. They're just a couple of years older than you. So I'm so proud of you. Thank you. Great.
Can I get another picture?
Sure.
And a friend at Douglas is here, so I want to.
Yeah. Are they going to come up here?
I'm going to go grab it.